Chapter 18. Betrayal. Still smarting under the cavalier treatment he had received, Mr. Wilding came forth from the castle to find Trenchard awaiting him among the crowd of officers and men that thronged the yard. Nick linked his arm through his friends and led him away. They quitted the place in silence, and in silence took their way south toward the high street, Nick waiting for Mr. Wilding to speak. Mr. Wilding's mind still in turmoil at the things he had endured. At last Nick halted suddenly and looked keenly at his friend in the failing light. "What a plague ails you, Tony?" said he sharply. "You are as silent as I am impatient for your news." Wilding told him in brief, disdainful terms of the reception they had given him at the castle, and of how they had blamed him for the circumstance that London had failed to proclaim itself for Monmouth. Trenchard snarled viciously. "'Tis that mongrel Grey," said he. "Oh, Anthony, to what an affair have we set our hands? Naught can prosper with that fellow in it." He laid his hand on Wilding's arm and lowered his voice. "As I have hinted before, 'twould not surprise me if time proved him a traitor. Failure attends him everywhere, and so unfailingly that one wonders is not failure invited by him. And that fool Monmouth, pshaw! See what it is to serve a weakling. With another in his place, and the country disaffected as it is, we have been masters of England by now." Two ladies passed him at that moment, cloaked and hooded, walking briskly. One of them turned to look at Trenchard, who, waving his arms in wild gesticulation, was a conspicuous object. She checked in her walk, arresting her companion. "Mr. Wilding!" she exclaimed. It was Lady Horton. "Mr. Wilding!" cried Diana, her companion. Wilding doffed his hat and bowed, Trenchard following his example. "We had scarce looked to see you in Bridgewater again," said the mother, her mild, pleasant countenance reflecting the satisfaction it gave her to behold him safe and sound. "There have been moments," answered Wilding, "when myself I scarce expected to return. Your ladyship's greeting shows me what I had lost had I not done so." "You are but newly arrived?" quoth Diana, scanning him in the gloaming. "From London, an hour since." "An hour?" she echoed, and observed that he was still booted and dust-stained. "You will have been at Lupton House?" A shadow crossed his face. His glance seemed to grow clouded, all of which watchful Diana did not fail to observe. "Not yet," said he. "You are a laggard." She laughed at him, and he felt the blood driven back upon his heart. What did she mean? Was it possible, she suggested, that he should be welcome, that his wife's feelings towards him had undergone a change? His last parting from her on the road near Walford had been ever in his mind. "I have had weighty business to transact," he replied, and Trenchard snorted, his mind flying back to the council room at the castle, and what his friend had told him. "But now that you're disposed of that, you will sup with us," said Lady Horton, who was convinced that since Ruth had gone to the altar with him, he was Ruth's lover in spite of the odd things she had heard. Appearances with Lady Horton counted for everything, and all that glitter was gold to her. "I would," he answered, "but that I am to sup at Mr. Nullington's with His Majesty. My visit must wait until tomorrow." "Let us hope," said Trenchard, "that it waits no longer." He was already instructed touching the night attack on Feversham's camp on Sedgemoor, and thought it likely Wilding would accompany them. "You are going to Mr. Nullington's?" said Diana, and Trenchard thought she had turned singularly pale. Her hand was over her heart, her eyes wide. She seemed about to add something, but checked herself. She took her mother's arm. "We are detaining Mr. Wilding, mother," said she, and her voice quivered as if her whole being were shaken by some gusty agitation. They spoke their farewells briefly and moved on. A second later Diana was back at their side again. "Where are you lodged, Mr. Wilding?" she inquired. "With my friend Trenchard, at the sign of the Ship by the Cross." She briefly acknowledged the information, rejoined her mother, and hurried away with her. Trenchard stood staring after them a moment. "Odd," said he. "Did you mark that girl's discomposure?" But Wilding's thoughts were elsewhere. "Come, Nick, if I am to render myself fit to sit at table with Monmouth, we'll need to hasten." They went their way, but not so fast as when Diana, urging with her protesting and short-winded mother. "Where is your mistress?" the girl asked excitedly of the first servant she met at Lupton House. "In her room, madam," the man replied, and to Ruth's room went Diana breathlessly, leaving Lady Horton gaping after her and understanding nothing. Ruth, who was seated pensive by her window, rose on Diana's impetuous entrance, and in the deepening twilight, she looked almost ghostly in her gown of shimmering white satin, sewn with pearls about the neck of the low-cut bodice. "Diana," she cried, "you startle me." "Not so much as I am yet to do," answered Diana, breathing excitement. She threw back the wimple from her head, and pulling away her cloak, tossed it onto the bed. "Mr. Wilding is in Bridgewater," she announced. There was a faint rustle from the stiff satin of Ruth's gown. Then her voice shook slightly. Then, "He is not dead," she said, more because she felt that she must say something than because her words fitted the occasion. "Not yet," said Diana grimly. "Not yet. He sups tonight at Mr. Nullington's," Miss Horton exclaimed in a voice pregnant with meaning. "Ah!" It was a cry from Ruth, sharp as if she had been stabbed. She sank back to her seat by the window, smitten down by this sudden news. There was a pause, which fretted Diana, who now craved knowledge of what might be passing in her cousin's mind. She advanced towards Ruth and laid a trembling hand on her shoulder, where the white gown met the ivory neck. "He must be warned," she said. But how?" stammered Ruth. "To warn him were to betray Sir Rowland." "Sir Rowland?" cried Diana in high scorn. And Richard," Ruth continued. "Yes, and Mr. Nullington and all the other knaves that are engaged in this murderous business." "Well," she demanded, "will you do it, or must I?" "Do it." Ruth's eyes sought her cousin's white, excited face in the quasi-darkness. "But have you thought of what it will mean? Have you thought of the poor people that will perish unless the Duke is taken and this rebellion brought to an end?" "Thought of it?" repeated Diana witheringly. "Not I. I have thought that Mr. Wilding is here and like to have his throat cut before an hour is past." "Tell me, are you sure of this?" asked Ruth. "I have it from your husband's own lips," Diana answered, and told her in a few words of her meeting with Mr. Wilding. Ruth sat with hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the dim violet afterglow in the west, and her mind wrestling with this problem that Diana had brought her. "Do," echoed Diana. "Is it not plain? Warn Mr. Wilding." "But Richard—" "Then why hesitate? My duty is also to keep faith with Richard, to think of those poor misguided folk who are to be saved by this," cried Ruth in agony. "If Mr. Wilding is warned, they will all be ruined." Diana stamped her foot impatiently. "Had I thought to find you in this mind, I had warned him myself," said she. "Ah, why did you not?" "You think of Richard," she exclaimed, "and you know that Richard is to have no active part in the affair, that he will run no risk. They have assigned him but a sentry duty that he may warn Blake and his followers if any danger threatens them." "And is Mr. Wilding to be slaughtered with his friends?" Diana asked her. "Resolve me that. Time presses. In half an hour it will be too late." That allusion to the shortness of the time brought Ruth an inspiration. Suddenly she saw a way. Wilding should be saved, and yet she would not break faith with Richard nor ruin those others. She would detain him, and whilst warning him at the last moment, in time for him to save himself, not do so until it must be too late for him to warn the others. Thus she would do her duty by him, and yet keep faith with Richard and Sir Rowland. She had resolved, she thought, the awful difficulty that had confronted her. She rose suddenly, heartened by the thought. "Give me your cloak and wimple," she bade Diana, and Diana flew to do her bidding. "Where is Mr. Wilding lodged?" she asked. "At the sign of the ship, overlooking the cross, with Mr. Trenchard. Shall I come with you?" "No," answered Ruth without hesitation. "I will go alone." She drew the wimple well over her head, so that in its shadows her face might lie concealed, and hid her shimmering white dress under Diana's cloak. She hastened through the ill-lighted streets, never heeding the rough cobbles that hurt her feet, shod in light indoor wear, never heeding the crowds that thronged her way. All Bridgewater was astir with Monmouth's presence. Moreover, there had been great incursions from Taunton and the surrounding country, the women folk of the Duke King's followers having come that day to Bridgewater to say farewell to father and son, husband and brother, before the army marched, as was still believed, to Gloucester. The half-hour was striking from St. Mary's, the church in which she had been married, as Ruth reached the door of the sign of the ship. She was about to knock, when suddenly it opened and Mr. Wilding himself, with Trenchard immediately behind him, stood confronting her. At sight of him, a momentary weakness took her. He had changed from his hard-used riding garments into a suit of roughly corded black silk, which threw into relief the steely litheness of his spare figure. His dark brown hair was carefully dressed. Diamonds gleamed in the cravat of snowy lace at his throat. He was uncovered, his hat under his arm, and he stood aside to make way for her, imagining that she was some woman of the house. "Mr. Wilding," said she, her heart fluttering in her throat. May I speak with you?" "Ruth!" he cried, and came quickly forward. Trenchard, behind him, looked on and scowled with sudden impatience. Mr. Wilding's philanderings with this lady had never had the old rake's approval. Too much trouble already had resulted from them. "I must speak with you at once." "At once," she urged him, her tone fearful. "Are you in need of me?" he asked concernedly. "In very urgent need," said she. "I thank God," he answered without flippancy. "You shall find me at your service." "Tell me." Not here," she answered him. "Where else?" said he. "Shall we walk?" No. Her repetitions marked the deep excitement that possessed her. "I will go in with you." And she signed with her head toward the door from which he was barely emerged. "'Twere scarce fitting," said he, for being confused and full of speculation on the score of her need, he had for the moment almost overlooked the relations in which they stood. In spite of the ceremony through which they had gone together, Mr. Wilding still mostly thought of her as of a mistress very difficult to woo. "Fitting," she echoed, and then after a pause, "Am I not your wife?" she asked him in a low voice, her cheeks crimsoning. "Ha! 'Pon honor, I had almost forgot," said he, and though the burden of his words seemed mocking, their tone was sad. Of the passers-by that jostled them, a couple had now paused to watch a scene that had an element of the unusual in it. She pulled her wimple closer to her face, took him by the arm, and drew him with her into the house. "Close the door," she bade him, and Trenchard, who had stood aside that they might pass in, forestalled him in obeying her. "Now lead me to your room," said she, and Wilding in amaze turned to Trenchard as if asking his consent, for the lodging, after all, was Trenchard's. "I'll wait here," said Nick, and waved his hand towards an oak bench that stood in the passage. "You had best make haste," he urged his friend. "You are late already. That is, unless you are of a mind to set the lady's affairs before King Monmouth's. And were I in your place, Anthony, faith I'd not scruple to do it. For after all," he added under his breath, "there's little choice in rotten apples." Ruth waited for some answer from Wilding that might suggest he was indifferent whether he went to Nullington's or not. But he spoke no word as he turned to lead the way above stairs to the indifferent parlor, which for the adjoining bedroom constituted Mr. Trenchard's lodging and his own for the time being. Having assured herself that the curtains were closely drawn, she put by her cloak and hood, and stood revealed to him in the light of the 3 candles, burning in a branch upon the bare oak table, dazzlingly beautiful in her gown of ivory white. He stood apart, cogitating her with glowing eyes, the faintest smile between question and pleasure hovering about his thin mouth. He had closed the door, and stood in silence waiting for her to make known to him her pleasure. "Mr. Wilding," she began, and straightway he interrupted her. "But a moment since you did remind me that I have the honor to be your husband," he said with grave humor. "Why seek now to overcloud that fact? I mind me that the last time we met you called me by another name. But it may be," he added as an afterthought, "you are of opinion that I have broken faith with you." "Broken faith? As how?" "So," he said and sighed. "My words were so little account that they have been, I see, forgotten. Yet, so that I remember them, that is what chiefly matters. I promised then, or seemed to promise, that I would make a widow of you, who had made a wife of you against your will. It has not happened yet. Do not despair. This Monmouth quarrel is not yet fought out. Hope on, my Ruth." She looked at him with eyes wide open, lustrous eyes of sapphire in a face of ivory. A faint smile parted her lips, the reflection of thought in her mind that had she, indeed, been eager for his death, she would not be with him at this moment. Had she desired it, how easy would her course have been. "You do me wrong to bid me hope for that," she answered him, her tones level. I do not wish the death of any man unless, she paused. Her truthfulness urged her too far. Unless, said he, brows raised, polite interest on his face. Unless it be his Grace of Monmouth. He considered her with suddenly narrowed eyes. You have not by chance sought me to talk politics, said he. Or, and he suddenly caught his breath, his nostrils dilating with rage at the bare thought that leapt into his mind. Had Monmouth, the notorious libertine, been to Lupton House and persecuted her with his addresses? Is it that you are acquainted with his Grace? He asked. I have never spoken to him, she answered, with no suspicion of what was in his thoughts. In his relief he laughed, remembering now that Monmouth affairs were too absorbing just at present to leave him room for dalliance. But you are standing, said he, and he advanced a chair. I deplore that I have no better hospitality to offer you. I doubt if I ever shall again. I am told that Albemarle did me the honor to stable his knackers in my hall at Zoyland. She took the chair he offered her, sinking to it like one physically weary, a thing he was quick to notice. He watched her, his body eager, his soul trammeling it with steely restraint. Tell me now, said he, in what you need me. She was silent a moment, pondering, hesitation, and confusion seeming to envelop her. A pink flush rose to color the beautiful pillar of neck and overspread the delicate half-averted face. He watched it, wondering. How long? She asked him, her whole intent at present being to delay him and gain time. How long have you been in Bridgewater? 2 hours at most, said he. 2 hours. And yet you never came to me. I heard of your presence, and I feared you might intend to abstain from seeking me. He almost held his breath while she spoke, caught in amazement. He was standing close beside her chair. His right hand rested upon its tall back. Did you so intend? She asked him. I told you even now, he answered with hard-won calm, that I had made you a sort of promise. I would not have you keep it, she murmured. She heard his sharply indrawn breath, felt him leaning over her, and was filled with an unaccountable fear. Was it to tell me this you came? He asked her, his voice reduced to a whisper. No. Yes, she answered, an agony in her mind, which groped for some means to keep him by her side until his danger should be overpast. That much she owed him in honor, if in nothing else. No, yes, he echoed, and he had drawn himself erect again. What does you mean, Ruth? I mean that it was that, yet not quite only that. Disappointment vibrated faintly in his clamation. What else? I would have you abandon Monmouth's following, she told him. He stared a moment, moved away and round where he could confront her. The flush had now faded from her face. This he observed in the heave of her bosom, in its low bodice. He knit his brows, perplexed. Here was surely more than at first might seem. Why so? He asked. For your own safety's sake, she answered him. You are oddly concerned for that, Ruth. Concerned, not oddly. She paused an instant, swallowed hard, and then continued. I am concerned, too, for your honor, and there is no honor in following his banner. He has crowned himself king, and so proved himself a self-seeker who came dissembled as the champion of a cause that he might delude poor ignorant folk into flocking to his standard and helping him to his ambitious ends. You are wondrously well schooled, said he. Whose teachings do you recite me? Sir Rowland Blake's. At another time the sneer might have cut her. At the moment she was too intent upon gaining time. The means to it mattered little. The more she talked to no purpose, the more at random was her discourse, the better would her ends be served. Sir Rowland Blake? She cried. What is he to me? What? Let me set you the question rather. Less than nothing, she assured him, and for some moments afterwards it was this Sir Rowland who served them as a topic for their odd interview. On the overmantel the pulse of time beat on from a little wooden clock. His eyes strayed to it. It marked the 3/4. He bethought him suddenly of his engagement. Trenchard, below stairs, supremely indifferent whether Wilding went to Nullington's or not, smoked on, entirely unconcerned by the flight of time. Mistress, said Wilding suddenly, you have not yet told me in what you seek my service. Indeed, we seem to have talked to little purpose. My time is very short. Where are you going? She asked him, and fearfully she shot a sidelong glance at the timepiece. It was still too soon, by at least 5 minutes. He smiled, but his smile was singular. He began to suspect at last that her only purpose, to what end he could not guess, was to detain him. She rose, her agitation suddenly increasing, afraid that after all he would escape her. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Answer me that, and I will tell you why I came. I am to sup at Mr. Nullington's in His Majesty's company." "His Majesty's?" "King Monmouth's," he explained impatiently. "Come, Ruth. Already I am late." He considered her from under frowning eyes. "Ruth," he said, and he took her hands, "there is here something that I do not understand." "What does she mean?" "Promise me that you will not go to Nullington's, and I will tell you. But what has Nullington to do with—" "Nay, I am pledged already go." She drew closer to him, her hands upon his shoulders. "Yet if I ask you, I, your wife," she pleaded, and almost won him to her will. But suddenly he remembered another occasion on which, for purposes of her own, she had so pleaded. He laughed softly, mockingly. "Do you woo me, Ruth, who, when I wooed you, would have none of me?" She drew back from him, crimsoning. "I think I had better go," said she. "You have nothing but mockery for me. It was ever so. Who knows?" She sighed as she took up her mantle. "Had you but observed more gentle ways, you—" She paused, needing to say no more. "Good night," she ended and made shift to leave. He watched her, deeply mystified. She had gained the door when suddenly he moved. "Wait," he cried. She paused and turned to look over her shoulder, her hand apparently upon the latch. "You shall not go until you have told me why you besought me to keep away from Nullington's." "What is it?" he asked and paused suddenly, a flood of light breaking upon his mind. "Is there some treachery afoot?" he asked her, and his eye went wildly to the clock. A harsh, grating sound rang through the room. "What are you doing?" he cried. "Why have you locked the door?" She was tugging and fumbling desperately to extract the key, her hands all clumsy in her nervous haste. He leapt at her, but in that moment the key came away in her hand. She wheeled round to face him, erect, defiant almost. "Here is some devilry," he cried. "Give me that key." He had no need for further questions. Here was a proof more eloquent than words to his ready wit. Sir Roland or Richard, or both, were in some plot for the Duke's ruin, perhaps assassination. Had not her very words shown that she herself was out of all sympathy with Monmouth? He was out of sympathy himself, but not to the extent of standing by to see his throat cut. She would have the plot succeed, whatever it might be, and yet that he himself be spared. There his thoughts paused, but only for a moment. He saw suddenly in this, not a proof of concern born of love, but of duty towards him who had imperiled himself once, and for all time, indeed, that he might save her brother and Sir Roland. He told her what had been so suddenly revealed to him, taxing her with it. She acknowledged it, her wits battling to find some way by which she might yet gain a few moments more. She would cling to the key, and though he should offer her violence, she would not let it go without a struggle, and that struggle must consume the little time yet wanting to make it too late for him to save the Duke, and, what imported more, thus save herself from betraying her brother's trust. Another fear leapt at her suddenly. If through deed of hers Monmouth was spared that night, Blake, in his despair and rage, might slake his vengeance upon Richard. "Give me that key," he demanded, his voice cold and quiet, his face set. "No, no," she cried, setting her hand behind her. "You shall not go, Anthony. You shall not go." "I must," he insisted, still cold, but oh, so determined. "My honor's in it now that I know." "You'll go to your death," she reminded him. He sneered. "What signifies a day or so? Give me the key." "I love you, Anthony," she cried, livid to the lips. "Lies," he answered her contemptuously. "The key." "No," she answered, and her firmness matched his own. "I will not have you slain. 'Tis not my purpose, not just yet, but I must save the others. God forgive me if I offer violence to a woman," he added, "and lay rude hands upon her. Do not compel me to it." He advanced upon her, but she, lithe and quick, evaded him and sprang for the middle of the room. He wheeled about, his self-control all slipping from him now. Suddenly she darted to the window, and with the hand that clenched the key, she smote a pane with all her might. There was a smash of shivering glass, followed an instant later by a faint tinkle on the stones below, and the hand that she still held out covered itself all with blood. "Oh, God," he cried, the key and all else forgotten. "You are hurt, but you are saved," she cried, overwrought and staggered, laughing and sobbing, to a chair, sinking her bleeding hand to her lap, and smearing recklessly her spotless, shimmering gown. He caught up a chair by its legs, and at a single blow smashed down the door, a frail barrier after all. "Nick!" he roared. "Nick!" He tossed a chair from him and vanished into the adjoining room to reappear a moment later carrying basin and ewer and a shirt of Trenchard's, the first piece of linen he could find. She was half fainting, and she let him have his swift, masterful way. He bayed her hand, and was relieved to find that the injury was none so great as the flow of blood had made him fear. He tore Trenchard's fine cambric shirt to shreds, a matter on which Trenchard afterwards commented in quotations from at least 3 famous Elizabethan dramatists. He bound up her hand, just as Nick made his appearance at the splintered door, his mouth open, his pipe gone out between his fingers. He was followed by a startled serving wench, the only other person in the house, for everyone was out of doors that night. Into the woman's care Wilding delivered his wife, and without a word to her he left the room, dragging Trenchard with him. It was striking 9 as they went down the stairs, and the sound brought as much satisfaction to Ruth above as dismay to Wilding below. Chapter 19. The banquet. It was striking 9. Therefore, Ruth thought that she had achieved her object. Wilding imagined that all was lost. It needed the more tranquil mind of Nicholas Trenchard to show him the fly in Madame's ointment, after Wilding, in half a dozen words, had made him acquainted with the situation. "What are you going to do?" asked Trenchard. "Run to Nullington's and warn the Duke, if still in time." "And thereby precipitate the catastrophe?" "Oh, give it thought. It is all it needs. You are taking it for granted that 9 o'clock is the hour appointed for King Monmouth's butchery." "What else?" asked Wilding, impatient to be off. They were standing in the street under the sign of the Ship, by which Jonathan Edney, Mr. Trenchard's landlord, distinguished his premises and the chandler's trade he drove there. Trenchard set a detaining hand on Mr. Wilding's arm. 9 o'clock is the hour appointed for supper. It is odds the Duke will be a little late, and it is more than odds that when he does arrive, the assassins will wait until the company is safely at table and lulled by good eating and drinking. You had overlooked that, I see. It asks an old head for wisdom, after all. Look you, Anthony. Speed to Colonel Wade as fast as your legs can carry you, and get a score of men. Then find some fellow to lead you to Nullington's orchard. And if only you do not arrive too late, you may take Sir Roland and his cutthroats in the rear, and destroy them to a man before they realize themselves attacked. I'll reconnoiter while you go, and keep an eye on the front of the house. Away with you." Ordinarily, Wilding was a man of a certain dignity, but you had not thought it had you seen him running in silk stockings and silver-buckled shoes at a headlong pace through the narrow streets of Bridgewater, in the direction of the castle. He overset more than one, and others followed him from these and from others whom he rudely jostled out his path. Wade was gone with Monmouth, but he came upon Captain Slape, who had a company of scythes and musketeers incorporated in the Duke's own regiment, and to him Wilding gasped out the news and his request for a score of men with what breath was left him. Time was lost, and never was time more precious, in convincing Slape that this was no old wife's tale. At last, however, he won his way in 20 musketeers, but the quarter past the hour had chimed ere they left the castle. He led them forth at a sharp run, with never a thought for the circumstance that they would need their breath anon, perhaps for fighting, and he bade the man who guided them take them by back streets that they might attract as little attention as possible. Within a stone's throw of the house he halted them, and sent one forward to reconnoiter, following himself with the others as quietly and noiselessly as possible. Mr. Nullington's house was all alight, but from the absence of uproar, sounds were in plenty from the main street, where a dense throng had collected to see His Majesty go in. Mr. Wilding inferred with supreme relief that they were still in time. But the danger was not yet past. Already, perhaps, the assassins were penetrating, or had penetrated, to the house, and at any moment such sounds might greet them as would announce the execution of their murderous design. Meanwhile, Mr. Trenchard, having relighted his pipe and set his hat rakishly atop his golden wig, strolled up the High Street, swinging his long cane very much like a gentleman taking the air in quest of an appetite for supper. He strolled past across and on until he came to the handsome mansion, one of the few handsome houses in Bridgewater, where opulent Mr. Nullington had his residence. A small crowd had congregated about the doors, for word had gone forth that His Majesty was to sup there. Trenchard moved slowly through the people, seemingly uninterested, but, in fact, scanning closely every face he encountered. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he espied in the indifferent light Mr. Richard Westmacott. Trenchard passed him, jostling him as he went, and strolled on some few paces, then turned and came slowly back, and observed that Richard had also turned and was now watching him as he approached. He was all but upon the boy when suddenly his wrinkled face lighted with recognition. "Mr. Westmacott," he cried, and there was surprise in his voice. Richard, conscious that Trenchard must no doubt regard him as a turn-tippet, flushed and stood aside to give passage to the other. But Mr. Trenchard was by no means minded to pass. He clapped a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Nay," he cried, between laughter and feigned resentment. "Do you bear me ill will, lad?" Richard was somewhat taken aback. "For what should I bear you ill will, Mr. Trenchard?" quoth he. Trenchard laughed frankly, and so uproariously that his hat, over jauntily cocked, was all but shaken from his head. "I mind me the last time we met, I played you an unfair trick," said he. His tone bespoke the very highest good humor. He slipped his arm through Richard's. "Never bear an old man malice, lad," said he. "I assure you that I bear you none," said Richard, relieved to find that Trenchard apparently knew nothing of his defection, yet wishing that Trenchard would go his ways, for Richard's task was to stand sentry there. "I'll not believe you till you afford me proof," Trenchard replied. "You shall come and wash your resentment down in the best bottle of Canary the White Cow can furnish us." "You are thinking of the last occasion on which I drank with you," said Trenchard reproachfully. "Not so, but I am not thirsty." He passed up the steps, at the top of which Mr. Nullington, fat and pale and monstrously overdressed, stood bowing to welcome his royal visitor. Host and guest vanished, followed by some 6 officers of Monmouth's, among whom were Grey and Wade. The sightseers flattened themselves against the walls as the great lumbering coach put about and went off again the way it had come, the lifeguards following after. "Come," said he, renewing his invitation. "We shall both be the better for a little milk of the white cow." "No, no," he muttered, "if you will excuse me." "Not I," said Trenchard, drawing from his hesitation a shrewd inference as to Richard's business. "To drink alone is an abomination I'll not be guilty of. Shalt urge me no excuses, or we'll quarrel. Come," and he moved on, dragging Richard with him. They mounted the 3 steps and entered the common room of the inn. It was well thronged at the time, but they found places at the end of a long table, and there they sat and discussed the landlady's canary for the best part of a half-hour, until a sudden spatter of musketry, near at hand, came to startle the whole room. There was a momentary stillness in the tavern, succeeded by an excited clamoring, a dash for the windows, and a storm of questions, to which none could return any answer. Richard had risen with a sudden exclamation, very pale and scared of aspect. Trenchard tugged at his sleeve. "Sit down," said he. "Sit down. It will be nothing." "Nothing?" echoed Richard, and his eyes were suddenly bent on Trenchard in a look in which suspicion was now blent with terror. A second volley of musketry crackled forth at that moment, and the next the whole street was in an uproar. Men were running and shots resounded on every side, above all which predominated the cry that His Majesty was murdered. In an instant the common room of the White Cow was emptied of every occupant save 2, Trenchard and Westmacott. Neither of them felt the need to go forth in quest of news. They knew how idle was the cry in the streets. They knew what had taken place, and knowing it, Trenchard smoked unplacidly, satisfied that Wilding had been in time, whilst Richard stood stricken and petrified by dismay at realizing, with even greater certainty, that something had supervened to thwart, perhaps to destroy, Sir Rowland, for he knew that Blake's party had gone forth armed with pistols only, and intent not to use even these save in the last extremity. To avoid noise they were to keep to steel. This knowledge gave Richard positive assurance that the volleys they had heard must have been fired by some party that had fallen upon Blake's men and taken them by surprise. At a blow, Richard dashed the thing from his companion's mouth and fingers. Trenchard looked up startled. "What the devil?" he began. "It is your fault," cried Richard, his eyes blazing, his lips livid. "It was you who lured me hither." Trenchard stared at him in bland surprise. "Now, what a plague is your saying?" he asked, and brought Richard to his senses by awakening in him the instinct of self-preservation. How could he explain his meaning without betraying himself? And surely that were a folly, now that the others were no doubt disposed of. Let him, rather, bethink him of his own safety. Trenchard looked at him keenly, with well-assumed intent to read what might be passing in his mind, then rose, paid for the wine, and expressed his intention of going forth to inquire into these strange matters that were happening in Bridgewater. Meanwhile, those volleys fired in Mr. Nullington's orchard had caused, as well may be conceived, an agitated interruption of the superb feast Mr. Nullington had spread for his noble and distinguished guests. The Duke had for some days been going in fear of his life, for already he had been fired at more than once by men anxious to earn the price at which his head was valued. Instantly, he surmised that whatever that firing might mean, it indicated some attempt to surprise him with the few gentlemen who attended him. The whole company came instantly to its feet, and Colonel Wade stepped to a window that stood open, for the night was very warm. The Duke turned for explanation to his host. The traitor, however, professed himself entirely unable to offer any. He was very pale, and his limbs were visibly trembling, but then his agitation was most natural. His wife and daughter supervened at that moment, in their alarm entering the room unceremoniously, in spite of the august presence, to inquire into the meaning of this firing, and to reassure themselves that their father and his illustrious guests were safe. From the windows they could observe a stir in the gardens below. Black shadows of men flitted to and fro, and a loud, rich voice was heard calling to them to take cover, that they were betrayed. Then a sheet of livid flame blazed along the summit of the low wall, and a second volley of musketry rang out, succeeded by cries and screams from the assailed and the shouts of the assailers who were now pouring into the garden to the battered doorway and over the wall. For some moments steel rang on steel, and pistol shots cracked here and there to the accompaniment of voices, raised some in anger, some in pain. But it was soon over, and a comparative stillness succeeded. A voice called up from the darkness under the windows to know if His Majesty was safe. There had been a plot to take him, but the ambuscaders had been ambuscaded in their turn, and not a man of them remained, which was hardly exact, for under a laurel bush, scarce daring to breathe, lay Sir Rowland Blake, livid with fear and fury, and bleeding from a rapier scratch in the cheek, but otherwise unhurt. In the room above, Monmouth had sunk wearily into his chair upon hearing of the design there had been against his life. A deep, bitter melancholy enwrapped his spirit. Lord Grey's first thoughts flew to the man he most disliked, the one man missing from those who had been bidden to accompany His Majesty, whose absence had already formed the subject of comment. Grey remembered this baron before the council that same evening, and his undisguised resentment of the reproaches leveled against him. "Where's Mr. Wilding?" he asked suddenly, his voice dominating the din of talk that filled the room. "Do we hold the explanation of his absence?" Monmouth looked up quickly, his beautiful eyes ineffably sad, his weak mouth drooping at the corners. Wade turned to confront Grey. "Your lordship does not suggest that Mr. Wilding can have a hand in this?" "Appearances would seem to point in that direction," answered Grey, and in his wicked heart he almost hoped it might be so. "Then appearances speak true for once," came a bitter, ringing voice. They turned, and there on the threshold stood Mr. Wilding. Unheard, he had come upon them. He was bareheaded and carried his drawn sword. There was blood upon it, and there was blood on the lace that half concealed the hand that held it. Otherwise, and saving that his shoes and stockings were sodden with the dew from the long grass in the orchard, he was as spotless as when he had left Ruth in Trenchard's lodging. His face, too, was calm, save for the mocking smile with which he eyed Lord Grey. Monmouth rose on his appearance, and put his hand to his sword in alarm. Grey whipped his own from the scabbard, and placed himself slightly in front of his master, as if to preserve him. "You mistake, sirs," said Wilding quietly. "The hand I have had in this affair has been to save your Majesty from your enemies." At the moment I should have joined you. Word was brought me of the plot that was laid, of the trap that was set for you. I hastened to the castle, and obtained a score of musketeers of Sleip's company. With those I surprised the murderers lurking in the garden there, and made an end of them. I greatly feared I should not come in time, but it is plain that heaven preserves your majesty for better days. In the revulsion of feeling, Monmouth's eyes shone moist. Gray sheathed the sword with an awkward laugh, and a still more awkward word of apology to Wilding. The Duke, moved by a sudden impulse to make amends for his unworthy suspicions, for his perhaps unworthy reception of Wilding earlier that evening in the council room, drew the sword on which his hand still rested. He advanced a step. "Kneel, Mr. Wilding," he said in a voice stirred by emotion. But Wilding's stern spirit scorned this all too sudden friendliness of Monmouth's as much as he scorned the accolade at Monmouth's hands. "There are more pressing matters to demand your majesty's attention," said Mr. Wilding coldly, advancing to the table as he spoke, and taking up a napkin to wipe his blade, "than the reward of an unworthy servant." Monmouth felt his sudden enthusiasm chilled by that tone and manner. "Mr. Nullington," said Mr. Wilding, after the briefest of pauses, and the fat, sinful merchant started forward in alarm. It was like a summons of doom. "His Majesty came hither, I am informed, to receive at your hands a sum of money, £20,000, towards expenses of the campaign. Have you the money at hand?" And his eye, glittering between cruelty and mockery, fixed itself upon the merchant's ashen face. It shall be forthcoming by morning," stammered Nullington. "By morning?" cried Gray, who, with the others, watched Mr. Nullington what time they all wondered at Mr. Wilding's question and the manner of it. "You knew that I marched tonight," Monmouth reproached the merchant. The merchant's wife and daughter stood beside him watching him and plainly uneasy. Before he could make any reply, Mr. Wilding spoke again. "The circumstance that he has not the money by him is a little odd, or would be were it not for what has happened. I would submit, your majesty, that you receive from Mr. Nullington not £20,000, as he had promised you, but 30,000, and that you receive it not as a loan as was proposed, but as a fine imposed upon him in consequence of his lack of care in the matter of his orchard." Monmouth looked at the merchant very sternly. "You have heard Mr. Wilding's suggestion," said he. "You may thank the God of traitors it was made, else we might have thought of a harsher course. You shall pay the money by 10 o'clock tomorrow to Mr. Wilding, whom I shall leave behind for the sole purpose of collecting it." He turned from Nullington in plain disgust. "I think, sirs, that here is no more to be done. Are the streets safe, Mr. Wilding?" "Not only safe, your majesty, but the 20 men of Sleip's and your own lifeguards are waiting to escort you." "Then in God's name let us be going," said Monmouth, sheathing his sword and moving towards the door. Not a second time did he offer to confer the honor of knighthood upon his savior. His wife and daughter ran to him and called him by name. Monmouth paused a moment to watch them from the doorway with eyes unmoved. But Mr. Nullington answered not their call, for he was dead. Chapter 20. The Reckoning. Ruth had sped home through the streets unattended, as she had come, heedless of the rude jostlings and ruder greetings she met with from those she passed. Heedless, too, of the smarting of her injured hand, for the agony of her soul was such that it whelmed all minor sufferings of the flesh. In the dining room at Lupton House, she came upon Diana and Lady Horton at supper, and her appearance, her white and distraught face and blood-smeared gown, brought both women to their feet in alarmed inquiry, no less than it brought Jasper, the butler, to her side with ready solicitude. Ruth answered him that there was no cause for fear, that she was quite well, had scratched her hand, no more, and with that dismissed him. When she was alone with her aunt and cousin, she sank into a chair and told him what had passed twixt her husband and herself, and most of what she said was Greek to Lady Horton. "Mr. Wilding has gone to warn the Duke," she ended, and the despair of her tone was tragical. "I sought to detain him until it should be too late. I thought I had done so, but, oh, I am afraid, Diana." "Afraid of what?" asked Diana. "Afraid of what?" Lady Horton begged to be enlightened, and was filled with horror when, from Diana, enlightenment was hers. Her sympathies were all with the handsome Monmouth, for he was beautiful and should therefore be triumphant. Poor Lady Horton never got beyond externals. That her nephew and Sir Rowland, whom she had esteemed, should be leagued in this dastardly undertaking against that lovely person horrified her beyond words. She withdrew soon afterwards, having warmly praised Ruth's action in warning Mr. Wilding, unable to understand that it should be no part of Ruth's design to save the Duke, and went to her room to pray for the preservation of the late king's handsome son. Left alone with her cousin, Ruth gave expression to the fears for Richard by which she was being tortured. Diana poured wine for her and urged her to drink. She sought to comfort and reassure her. But as moments passed and grew to hours, and still Richard did not appear, Ruth's fears that he had come harm were changed to certainty. There was a moment when, but for Diana's remonstrances, she had gone forth in quest of news. Bad news were better than this horror of suspense. What if Wilding's warning should have procured help, and Richard were slain in consequence? Oh, it was unthinkable. Diana, white of face, listened to and shared her fears. Even her shallow nature was stirred by the tragedy of Ruth's position, by dread lest Richard should indeed have met his end that night. In these moments of distress, she forgot her hopes of triumphing over Blake, of punishing him for his indifference to herself. At last, at something after midnight, there came a fevered rapping at the outer door. Both women started up, and with arms about each other, in their sudden panic, stood there waiting for the news that must be here at last. The door of the dining room was flung open. The women recoiled in their dread of what might come. Then Richard entered, Jasper's startled countenance showing behind him. He closed the door, shutting out the wondering servant, and they saw that, though his face was ashen and his limbs all a-tremble, he showed no sign of any hurt or effort. His dress was as meticulous as when last they had seen him. Ruth flew to him, flung her arms about his neck, and pressed him to her. "Oh, Richard, Richard!" she sobbed in the immensity of her relief. "Thank God! Thank God!" He wriggled peevishly in her embrace, disengaged her arms, and put her from him almost roughly. "Have done," he growled, and, lurching past her, he reached the table, took up a bottle, and brimmed himself a measure. He gulped the wine avidly, set down the cup, and shivered. "Where is Blake?" he asked. "Blake?" echoed Ruth, her lips white. Diana sank into a chair, watchful, fearful and silent, taking now no glory in the things she had encompassed. Richard beat his hands together in a passion of dismay. "Is he not here?" he asked and groaned. "Oh, God!" He flung himself all limp into a chair. "You have heard the news, I see," he said. "Not all of it," said Diana hoarsely, leaning forward. "Tell us what passed." He moistened his lips with his tongue. "We were betrayed," he said in a quivering voice. "Betrayed. Did I but know by whom?" He broke off with a bitter laugh and shrugged, rubbing his hands together and shivering till his shoulders shook. Blake's party was set upon by half a company of musketeers. Their corpses are strewn about old Nullington's orchard. Not one of them escaped. They say that Nullington himself is dead. He poured himself more wine. Ruth listened, her eyes burning, the rest of her as cold as ice. But, oh, thank God that you at least are safe, Dick." "How did you escape?" quoth Diana. "How?" He started as if he had been stung. He laughed in a high, cracked voice, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "How? Perhaps it is just as well that Blake has gone to his account. Perhaps," he checked on the word, and started to his feet. Diana screamed in sheer fright. Behind her the windows had been thrust open so violently that one of the panes was shivered. Blake stood under the lintel, scarce recognizable, so smeared was his face with the blood escaping from the wound his cheek had taken. His clothes were muddied, soiled, torn, and disordered. Framed there against the black background of the night, he stood and surveyed them for a moment, his aspect terrific. Then he leapt forward, bearing his sword as he came. An incoherent roar burst from his lips as he bore straight down upon Richard. "You damned, infernal traitor!" he cried. Draw, or die like the muckworm that you are. Out of my way, mistress, or I'll be doing you a mischief." "You are mad, Sir Roland," she told him in a voice that did something toward restoring him to his senses. His fierce eyes considered her a moment, and he controlled himself to offer an explanation. "The 20 that were with me lie stark under the stars in Nullington's garden," he told her, as Richard had told her already. "I escaped by a miracle, no less, but for what? Feversham will demand of me a stern account of those lives. Whilst I am found in Bridgewater, there will be a short shrift for me at the rebel hands. For my share in this affair is known, my name on every lip in the town. And why? He asked with sudden increase of fierceness. Why? Because that craven villain there betrayed me. He did not, she answered in so assured a voice that not only did it give him pause, but caused Richard, cowering behind her, to raise his head in wonder. Sir Rowland smiled his disbelief, and that smile, twisting his blood-smeared countenance, was grotesque and horrible. I left him to guard our backs, and give me warning if any approached, he informed her. I knew him for too great a coward to be trusted in the fight. So I gave him a safe task, and yet in that he failed me because he betrayed and sold me. He had not. I tell you he had not, she insisted. I swear it. He stared at her. There was no one else for it, he made answer, and bade her harshly stand aside. Diana, huddled together, watched and waited in horror for the end of these consequences of her work. Blake made a sudden movement to win past Ruth. Richard staggered to his feet intent on defending himself, but he was swordless. Retreat to the door suggested itself, and he half turned to attempt to gain it, when Ruth's next words arrested him, petrified him. There was someone else for it. Sir Rowland, she cried. It was not Richard who betrayed you. It was I. You. The fierceness seemed all to drop away from him, whelmed in the immensity of his astonishment. You. Then he laughed loud in scornful disbelief. You think to save him, he said. Should I lie? She asked him, calm and brave. You shall hear, she answered, and told him how at the last moment she had learnt not only that her husband was in Bridgewater, but that he was to sup at Nullington's with the Duke's party. I had no thought of betraying you or of saving the Duke, she said. I knew how justifiable was what you intended, but I could not let Mr. Wilding go to his death. I sought to detain him, warning him only when I thought it would be too late for him to warn others. But you delayed overlong, and... Had he been forewarned that Wilding was to be one of Monmouth's party at Mr. Nullington's, his pulses would have throbbed with joy, and he would have flung himself into his murderous task with twice the zest he had carried to it. And now he learnt that not only had she thwarted his schemes against Monmouth, but had deprived him of the ardently sought felicity of widowing her. He drew back his arm for the thrust. Diana huddled into her chair, too horror-stricken to speak or move. Richard, immediately behind his sister, saw nothing of what was passing and thought of nothing but his own safety. Then Blake paused, stepped back, returned his sword to its scabbard, and bending himself, but whether to bow or not was not quite plain. He took some paces backwards, then turned and went out by the window as he had come. But there was a sudden purposefulness in the way he did it that might have warned them this withdrawal was not quite the retreat it seemed. They watched him with many emotions, predominant among which was relief, and when he was gone Diana rose and came to Ruth. Come, she said, and sought to lead her from the room. But there was Richard now to be reckoned with, Richard from whom the palsy was a sudden fallen, now that the cause of it had withdrawn. He had his back to the door, and his weak mouth was pursed up into a semblance of resolution. His pale eyes looked stern, his white eyebrows bent together in a frown. Wait, he said. They looked at him, and the shadow of a smile almost flitted across Diana's face. He stepped to the door and, opening it, held it wide. Go, Diana, he said. Ruth and I must understand each other. Diana hesitated. You had better go, Diana, said her cousin, whereupon Mistress Horton went. Hot and fierce came the recriminations from Richard's lips when he and his sister were alone, and Ruth weathered the storm bravely until it was stemmed again by fresh fear in Richard. For Blake had suddenly reappeared. He came forward from his window, his manner composed and full of resolution. Young Westmacott recoiled, the heat all frozen out of him, but Blake scarce looked at him. His smoldering glance was all for Ruth, who watched him with incipient fear, despite herself. Madam, he said, 'tis not to be supposed a mind holding so much thought for a husband's safety could find room for any concern as to another's. I will ask you, knaveless, to consider what tale I am to bear Lord Feversham. What tale, said she. That will account for what has chanced. For my failure to discharge the task entrusted me, and for the slaughter of an officer of his and 20 men. Why ask me this? She demanded half angrily. Then suddenly bethinking her of how she had ruined his enterprise, and of the position in which she had placed him, she softened. Her clear mind held justice very dear. She approached. "Oh, I am sorry, sorry, Sir Roland," she cried. He sneered. He had wiped some of the blood from his face, but still looked terrible enough. "I—" She recoiled in fear. At once, he informed her. Sir Roland disdained to heed him. "Come, mistress," he said, and putting forward his hand, he caught her wrist and pulled her roughly towards him. She struggled to free herself, but he leered evilly upon her, no whit discomposed by her endeavors. Though short of stature, he was a man of considerable bodily strength, and she, though tall, was slight of frame. He released her wrist, and before she realized what he was about, he had stooped, passed an arm behind her knees, another round her waist, and, swinging her from her feet, took her up bodily in his arms. He turned about, and a scream broke from her. "Hold!" cried Richard. "Hold, you madman! Keep off, or I'll make an end of you before I go," roared Blake over his shoulder, for already he had turned about and was making for the window, apparently no more hindered by his burden than had she been a doll. Richard sprang to the door. "Jasper!" he bawled. "Jasper!" He had no weapons, as we have seen, else it may be that he had made an attempt to use them. Ruth got a hand free and caught at the window frame as Blake was leaping through. It checked their progress, but did not sensibly delay it. It was unfortunately her wounded hand with which she had sought to cling, and with an angry, brutal wrench Sir Roland compelled her to unclose her grasp. He sped down the lawn toward the orchard, where his horse was tethered, and now she knew in a subconscious sort of way why he had earlier withdrawn. He had gone to saddle for this purpose. She struggled now, thinking that he would be too hampered to compel her to his will. He became angry and set her down beside his horse, one arm still holding her. "Look you, mistress," he told her fiercely, living or dead, "you come with me to Feversham. Choose now." His tone was such that she never doubted he would carry out his threat, and so in dull despair she submitted, hoping that Feversham might be a gentleman and would recognize and respect a lady. Half fainting, she allowed him to swing her to the withers of his horse. Thus they threaded their way in the dim starlit night through the trees towards a gate. It stood open, and they passed out into the lane. There Sir Roland put his horse to the trot, which he increased to a gallop when he was over the bridge and clear of the town. Chapter 21. The sentence. Mr. Wilding, as we know, was to remain at Bridgewater for the purpose of collecting from Mr. Nullington the fine which had been imposed upon him. It is by no means clear whether Monmouth realized the fullness of the tragedy at the merchant's house, and whether he understood that, stricken with apoplexy at the thought of parting with so considerable a portion of his fortune, Mr. Nullington had not merely fainted, but had expired under his Grace's eyes. If he did realize that he was cynically indifferent, and lest we should be doing him an injustice by assuming this, we had better give him the benefit of the doubt, and take it that in the subsequent bustle of departure, his mind filled with the prospect of the night attack to be delivered upon his uncle's army at Sedgemoor, he thought no more either of Mr. Nullington or of Mr. Wilding. The latter, as we know, had no place in the rebel army, although a man of his hands. He was not a trained soldier, and notwithstanding that he may fully have intended to draw his sword for Monmouth when the time came, yet circumstances had led to continuing after Monmouth's landing the more diplomatic work of movement man, in which he had been engaged for the months that had preceded it. So it befell that when Monmouth's army marched out of Bridgewater at 11 o'clock on that Sunday night, not to make for Gloucester and Cheshire, as was generally believed, but to fall upon the encamped Feversham at Sedgemoor and slaughter the royal army in their beds, Mr. Wilding was left behind. Trenchard was gone, in command of his troop of horse, and Mr. Wilding had for only company his thoughts touching the singular happenings of that busy night. He went back to the sign of the ship overlooking the cross, and, kicking off his sodden shoes, he supped quietly in the room of which shattered door and broken window reminded him of his odd interview with Ruth, and of the comedy of love she had enacted to detain him there. The thought of it embittered him. The part she had played seemed to his retrospective mind almost a wanton's part, for all that in name she was his wife. And yet, underlying a certain irrepressible nausea, came the reflection that, after all, her purpose had been to save his life. It would have been a sweet thought, sweet enough to have overlaid that other bitterness, had he not insisted upon setting it down entirely to her gratitude and her sense of justice. She intended to repay the debt in which she had stood to him since, at the risk of his own life and fortune. He had rescued her brother from the clutches of the Lord Lieutenant at Taunton. Let him make it, and perhaps she would, out of gratitude, if out of no other feeling, come to think more kindly of him. And that night it seemed to him, as he sat alone in that mean chamber, that were a better and a sweeter thing to earn some measure her esteem by death than continue in a life that inspired her hatred and resentment, from which it will be seen how utterly he disbelieved the protestations she had uttered in seeking to detain him. They were, he was assured, a part of a scheme, a trick, to lull him while Monmouth and his officers were being butchered. And she had gone the length of saying she loved him. He regretted that, being as he was convinced of its untruth. What cause had she to love him? She hated him, and because she hated him, she did not scruple to lie to him, once with suggestions, and this time with actual expression of affection, that she might gain her ends that concern her brother and Sir Rowland Blake. Sir Rowland Blake. The name was a very goad to his passion and despair. He rose from the table and took a turn in the room, moving noiselessly in his stocking feet. He felt the need of air and action. The weariness of his flesh incurred in his long ride from London was cast off or forgotten. He must go forth. He picked up his fine shoes of Spanish leather, but as luck would have it, little though he guessed the extent just then, he found them hardening, though still damp from the dews of Mr. Nullington's garden. He cast them aside, and, taking a key from his pocket, unlocked an oak cupboard and withdrew the heavy muddy boots in which he had ridden from town. He drew them on and, taking up his hat and sword, went down the creaking stairs and out into the street. Bridgewater had fallen quiet by now. The army was gone and townsfolk were in their beds. Moodily, unconsciously, yet as if guided by a sort of instinct, he went down the High Street, and then turned off into the narrower lane that led in the direction of Lupton House. By the gates of this he paused, recalled out his abstraction, and rendered aware of whither his steps had led him by the sight of the hall door standing open, a black figure silhouetted against the light behind it. What was happening here? Why were they not abed like all decent folk? The figure called to him in a quavering voice. Mr. Wilding. Mr. Wilding! For the light beating upon his face and figure from the open door had revealed him. The form came swiftly forward, its steps pattering down the walk. Another slenderer figure surged in its place upon the threshold, hovered there an instant, then plunged down into the darkness to come after it. But the first was by now upon Mr. Wilding. "What is it, Jasper?" he asked, recognizing the old servant. "Mistress Ruth," wailed the fellow, wringing his hands. She has been carried off." He got out in gasps, winded by his short run and by the excitement that possessed him. No word said Wilding. He just stood and stared, scarcely understanding, and in that moment they were joined by Richard. He seized Wilding by the arm. "Blake has carried her off," he cried. "Blake?" said Mr. Wilding, and wondered with a sensation of nausea was an ordinary running away. But Richard's next words made it plain to him that it was no amorous elopement, nor even amorous abduction. He has carried her to Feversham for her betrayal of his tonight's plan to seize the Duke. That stirred Mr. Wilding. He wasted no time in idle questions or idle complainings. "How long since?" he asked, and it was he who clutched Richard now, by the shoulder and with a hand that hurt. "Not 10 minutes ago," was a quavering answer. "And you were a hand when it befell?" cried Wilding, the scorn in his voice rising superior to his agitation and fears for Ruth. "You were at hand, and could neither prevent nor follow him?" "I'll go with you now, if you'll give chase," whimpered Richard, feeling himself for once the craven that he was. "If?" echoed Wilding scornfully, and dragged him past the gate and up toward the house even as he spoke. "Is there room for a doubt of it? Have you horses, at least?" "To spare," said Richard as they hurried on. They skirted the house and found the stable door open as Blake had left it. Old Jasper followed with a lamp which burned steadily. So calm was the air of that July night. In 3 minutes they had saddled a couple of nags. In 5 they were riding for the bridge in the road to Weston Zoyland. "It is a miracle you remained in Bridgewater," said Richard as they rode. "How came you to be left behind?" "I had a task assigned me in the town against the Duke's return tomorrow," Wilding explained, and he spoke almost mechanically, his mind full of anguish by thoughts of Ruth. "Against the Duke's return?" cried Richard, first surprised and then thinking that Wilding spoke at random. Against the Duke's return, he repeated. That is what I said. But the Duke is marching to Gloucester. The Duke is marching by circuitous ways to Sedgemoor, answered Wilding, never dreaming that at this time of day there could be the slightest imprudence in saying so much. Indeed, taking little heed of what he said, his mind obsessed by the other, to him, far weightier matter. To Sedgemoor, gasped Westmacott. Aye, to take Feversham by surprise, to destroy King James's soldiers in their beds. He should be near upon the attack by now. But there, spur on and save your breath if we are to overtake Sir Roland. They pounded on through the night at a breakneck pace, which they never slackened until, when within a quarter of a mile or so of Penzoy Pound, where the army was encamped and slumbering by now, they caught sight of the musketeers' matches glowing in the dark ahead of them. An outpost barred their progress. But Richard had the watchword, and he spurred ahead shouting Albemarle. And the soldiers fell back and gave them passage. On they galloped, skirting Penzoy Pound, the army sleeping in utter unconsciousness of the fate that was creeping stealthily upon out of the darkness and mist across the moors. They clattered on past Langmoor Stone and dashed straight into the village, Richard never drawing rein until he reached the door of the cottage where Feversham was lodged. They had come not only at a headlong pace, but in a headlong manner, without quite considering what awaited them at the end of their ride in addition to their object of finding Ruth. It was only now, as he drew rein before the lighted house and caught the sound of Blake's raised voice pouring through an open window on the ground floor, that Richard fully realized what manner of rashness he was committing. He was too late to rescue Ruth from Blake. What more could he look to achieve? His hope had been that with Wilding's help he might snatch her from Sir Roland before the latter reached his destination. But now, to enter Feversham's presence in an association with so notorious a rebel as Mr. Wilding were a piece of folly of the heroic kind that Richard did not savor. Indeed, had it not been for Wilding's masterful presence, it is more than odds he had turned tail and ridden home again to bed. But Wilding, who had leapt nimbly to the ground, stood waiting for Richard to dismount, impatient now that from the sound of Sir Roland's voice he had assurance that Richard had proved an able guide. The young man got down, but might yet have hesitated had not Wilding caught him by the arm and whirled him up the steps, through the open door, past the two soldiers who kept it, and who were too surprised to stay him, straight into the long, low-ceilinged chamber where Feversham, attended by a captain of horse, was listening to Blake's angry narrative of that night's failure. Mr. Wilding's entrance was decidedly sensational. He stepped quickly forward, and, taking Blake, who was still talking, all unconscious of those behind him, by the collar of his coat, he interrupted him in the middle of an impassioned period, wrenched him backwards off his feet, and dashed him with a force almost incredible into a heap in a corner of the room. There for some moments the baronet lay half dazed by the shock of his fall. There was an exclamation, half anger, half amazement, at Mr. Wilding's outrage upon Sir Roland, and the captain of horse sprang forward. But Wilding raised his hand, his face so composed and calm that it was impossible to think him conceiving any violence, as indeed he protested at that moment. "Be assured, gentlemen," he said, "that I have no further rudeness to offer any, so that this lady is suffered to withdraw with me." And he took in his own a hand that Ruth, amazed and unresisting, yielded up to him. That touch of his seemed to drive out her fears and to restore her confidence. The mortal terror in which she had been until his coming dropped from her now. She was no longer alone and abandoned to the vindictiveness of rude and violent men. She had beside her one in whom experience had taught her to have faith. Louis Duras, Marquis de Blankford, and Earl of Feversham, coughed with mock discreetness under cover of his hand. Ahem! He was a comely man with a long nose, good low-lidded eyes, a humorous mouth, and a weak chin. At a glance he looked what he was, a weak, good-natured sensualist. He was resplendent at the moment in a blue satin dressing gown stiff with gold lace, for he had been interrupted by Blake's arrival in the very act of putting himself to bed, and his head, divested of his wig, was bound up in a scarf of many colors. At his side, the red-coated captain, arrested by the general's sardonic cough, stood a red-faced, freckled boy, looking to his superior for orders. "I tink you ave ert Sir Roland," said Feversham composedly in his bad English. "Who are you, sir?" "This lady's husband," answered Wilding, whereupon the captain stared and Feversham's brows went up in surprised amusement. "Soho, tat true. Quote the latter in a tone suggesting that it explained everything to him. "'Tis jiff a different color to your story, Sir Roland." Then he added in a chuckle, "Ho, ho, Lamore," and laughed outright. Blake, gathering together his wits and his limbs at the same time, made shift to rise. "What plague does the relationship matter?" he began. He would have added more, but the Frenchman thought this question one that needed answering. "Parbleu," he swore, his amusement rising. "It seemed to matter somewhat. Damn me," swore Blake, red in the face from pale that he had been. "Do you conceive that if I had run away with his wife for her own sake, I had fetched her to you?" He lurched forward as he spoke, but kept his distance from Wilding, who stood between Ruth and him. Feversham bowed sardonically. "You are such flatterer, Sir Roland," said he, laughter bubbling in his words. Blake looked his scorn at this trivial Frenchman, who, upon sending what appeared to be the comedy of an outraged husband overtaking the man who had carried off his wife, forgot the serious business, a part of which Sir Roland had already imparted to him. Captain Wentworth, a time-serving gentleman, smiled with this French general of a British army, that he might win the great man's favor. "I have told your lordship," said Blake, froth on his lips, "that the 20 men I had from you, as well as Ensign Norris, are dead in Bridgewater, and that my plan to carry off King Monmouth has come to ruin, all because we were betrayed by this woman. It is now my further privilege to point out to your lordship the man to whom she sold us." Feversham misliked Sir Roland's arrogant tone, misliked his angry, scornful glance. His eyes narrowed, the laughter faded slowly from his face. Yes, I remember," said he. "'Tis lady you have told us, betray you. Very well, but you have not told us who betray you to Tia's lady." And he looked inquiringly at Blake. The baronet's jaw dropped. His face lost some of its high color. He was stunned by the question, as the bird is stunned that flies headlong against a pane of glass. He had crashed into an obstruction so transparent that he had not seen it. "So," said Feversham, and he stroked the cleft of his chin. "Captain Wentworth, be so kind as to call tea guard." Wentworth moved to obey. But before he had gone round the table, Blake had looked behind him and espied Richard shrinking by the door. "By heaven," he cried, "I can more than answer your lordship's question." Wentworth stopped, looking at Feversham. "Voyons," said the general, "I can place you in possession of the man who has wrought our ruin. He is there," and he pointed theatrically to Richard. Feversham looked at the limp figure in some bewilderment. Indeed, he was having a most bewildering evening, or morning, rather, for it was even then on the stroke of 1 o'clock. "Who are you, sir?" he asked. "I am this lady's brother, my lord," he answered, and his voice was fairly steady. "Tiens," said Feversham, and smiling, he turned to Wentworth. "Quite a family party, sir," said the captain, smiling back. "You are very good, sir," said Ruth, her voice brave and calm, but somewhat lacking in spontaneity. Wilding criticized, which set Wentworth staring and the Frenchman scowling. "Shall I call the guard, my lord?" asked Wentworth crisply. "I think yes," said Feversham, and the captain gained the door, and spoke a word to one of the soldiers without. "But, my lord," exclaimed Blake in a tone of protest, "I vow you are too ready to take this fellow's word." "He has spoke so few," said Feversham. "Do you know who he is?" "Aye, but his name," cried Blake, quivering with anger. "Do you know that it is Wilding?" The name certainly made an impression that might have flattered the man to whom it belonged. Feversham's whole manner changed. The trivial air of persiflage that he had adopted hitherto was gone on the instant, and his brow grew dark. "Tat true?" he asked sharply. "Are you Mr. Wilding, Mr. Antoine Wilding?" "Your lordship's most devoted servant," said Wilding suavely, and made a leg. Wentworth in the background paused in the act of reclosing the door to stare at this gentleman, whose name Albemarle had rendered so excellently well known. "And you to dare come here?" thundered Feversham, thoroughly roused by the other's airy indifference. "You to dare come here into my presence?" Blake, his face purple, seemed to struggle for breath and words. Mr. Wilding answered for him. "Sir Roland is so choleric, my lord," he said in his pleasant, level voice, "that perhaps the tale would come more intelligibly from me. Believe me that he has served you to the best of his ability." Unfortunately for the success of your choice plan of murder, I had news of it at the 11th hour, and with a party of musketeers, I was able to surprise and destroy your cutthroats in Mr. Nullington's garden. You see, my lord, I was to have been one of the victims myself, and I resented the attentions that were intended me. I had no knowledge that Sir Rowland had contrived to escape, and, frankly, it is a thing I deplore more than I can say, for had that not happened, much trouble might have been saved, and your lordship's rest had not been disturbed. But tea, woman, cried Feversham impatiently. How is she coming to this gaoler? It was she who warned him. Blake got out, as already I have had the honor to inform your lordship. And your lordship cannot blame her for that, said Wilding. The lady is a most loyal subject to King James, but she is also, as you observe, a dutiful wife. I will add that it was her intention to warn me only when too late for interference. Sir Rowland, as it happened, was slow in... Silence, blazed the Frenchman. Now, Tiet, I know who you are. Tiet make a so great difference. Where's T. Gar, Wentworth? I hear them, answered the captain, and from the street came the tramp of their marching feet. Feversham turned again to Blake. "'Te affairs happen so," he said, between question and assertion, summing up the situation as he understood it. "'Tis rogue," and he pointed to Richard. "Ave betray your plan to his sister, who betrayed to her husband who saved T. Duc de Monmouth. N'est-ce pas?" "That is so," said Blake, and Ruth scarcely thought it worthwhile to add that she had heard of the plot not only from her brother, but from Blake as well. After all, Blake's attitude in the matter, his action in bringing her to Feversham for punishment, and to exculpate himself, must suffice to cause any such statement of hers to be lightly received by the general. This was something that perhaps she scarcely realized just then, but she was to realize it soon. Feversham was speaking again, asking Blake a fresh question. "And who betrayed you to Tia's rogue?" "To Westmacott?" cried Blake. "He was in the plot with me. He was left to guard the rear, to see that we were not taken by surprise, and he deserted his post. Had he not done that, there had been no disaster, in spite of Mr. Wilding's intervention." Feversham's brow was dark. His eyes glittered as they rested on the traitor. "Tat true, sir?" he asked him. "Not quite," put in Mr. Wilding. "Mr. Westmacott, I think, was constrained away. He did not intend." "Ties toy," blazed Feversham. "Did I interrogate you? It is for Mr. Westmacott to answer." He set a hand on the table and leaned forward towards Wilding, his face very malign. "You shall answer for yourself, Mr. Wilding. I promise you shall answer for yourself." He turned again to Richard. "Eh bien," he snapped. "Will you speak?" Richard came forward a step. He was certainly nervous and certainly pale, but neither as pale nor as nervous as from our knowledge of Richard we might have looked to see him at that moment. "It is in a measure true," he said, "but what Mr. Wilding has said is more exact. I was induced away. I did not dream any could know of the plan, or that my absence could cause this catastrophe." "So you went Ivorian? You taught Tepi to do your duty, eh? And it was you who told your sister?" "I may have told her, but not before she had the tale already from Blake." Feversham sneered and shrugged. "Naturally you will not speak true. A traitor, I ave observe, is always liar." Richard drew himself up. He seemed invested almost with new dignity. "Your lordship is pleased to count me a traitor?" he inquired. "A damn traitor," said his lordship, and at that moment the door opened, and a sergeant, with 6 men following him, stood at the salute upon the threshold. "Allah bon his lordship hailed him. "Sir Gian, you will arrest Tia's rogue and Tia's lady," he waved his hand from Richard to Ruth, "and you will take Tiem to lock. Up!" The sergeant advanced towards Richard, who drew a step away from him. Ruth rose to her feet in agitation. Mr. Wilding interposed himself between her and the guard, his hand upon his sword. "My lord," he cried, "do they teach no better courtesy in France?" Feversham scowled at him, smiling darkly. "I shall talk with you soon, sir," said he, his words a threat. "But, my lord," began Richard, "I can make it very plain. I am no traitor." "In tea morning," said Feversham blandly, waving his hand, and the sergeant took Richard by the shoulder. But Richard twisted from his grasp. "In the morning will be too late," he cried. I have it in my power to render you such a service as you little dream of. Take him away, said Feversham wearily. I can save you from destruction, bawled Richard. You and your army. Perhaps even now Feversham had not heeded him but for Wilding's sudden interference. Feversham, however, chanced to observe that this man who had shown himself hitherto so calm looked suddenly most singularly perturbed. Quoth the general. An inn's tan, Sir Gian. What his tea is, And he looked from Wilding to Richard. Your lordship shall learn at a price, cried Richard. Me, I not bargain with traitors, said his lordship stiffly. Very well, then, answered Richard, and he folded his arms dramatically. But no matter what your lordship's life may be hereafter, you will never regret anything more bitterly than you shall regret this by sunrise, if indeed you live to see it. Feversham shifted uneasily on his feet. What you say, he asked. What you mean? You shall know at a price, said Richard again. Wilding, realizing the hopelessness of interfering now, stood gloomily apart, a great bitterness in his soul at the indiscretion he had committed in telling Richard the night attack that was afoot. Your lordship shall hear my price, but you need not pay it me until you have had an opportunity of verifying the information I have to give you. If your lordship will promise liberty and safe conduct to my sister and myself. Tell me, Feversham repeated, when you have promised to grant me what I ask in return for my information. Yes, if I think your information is worth. I am content, said Richard. He inclined his head and loosed the coral of his news. Your camp is slumbering. Your officers are all abed with the exception of the outpost on the road to Bridgewater. What should you say if I told you that Monmouth and all his army are marching upon you at this very moment, will probably fall upon you before another hour is past? Wilding uttered a groan, and his hands fell to his sides. Had Feversham observed this, he might have been less ready with his sneering answer. A lie, he answered and laughed. My friend, I ave myself been tonight, at midnight, on T. Moor, and I ave T. army of T. Duc de Monmouth marching to Bristol on T. Road. What you call T. Road, went word. The Eastern Causeway, my lord, answered the captain. That is part of Monmouth's plan to come at you across the moors, by way of Chedzoy, avoiding your only outpost, and falling upon you in your beds, all unawares. Lord, sir, do not take my word for it. Send out your scouts, and I dare swear they'll not need go far before they come upon the enemy. Feversham looked at Wentworth. His lordship's face had undergone a change. What you think? He asked. Indeed, my lord, it sounds so likely, answered Wentworth, that I marvel we did not provide against such a contingency. Feversham looked at him. His sneering smile returned. Me, I not remember, said he, that Mr. Westcott, ave include you in tea bargain. Nothing had been further from Wilding's thoughts than such a suggestion, and he snorted his disdain. The sergeant had fallen back at Feversham's words, and his men lined the wall of the chamber. The general bade Richard be seated whilst he waited. Sir Rowland stood apart, leaning wearily against the wainscot, waiting also, his dull wits not quite clear how Richard might come by so valuable a piece of information, his evil spirit almost wishing it untrue, in his vindictiveness, to the end that Richard might pay the price of having played him false and Ruth the price of having scorned him. Feversham meanwhile was seeking, with no great success, to engage Mr. Wilding in talk of Monmouth, against whom Feversham harbored in addition to his political enmity a very deadly personal hatred. For Feversham had been a suitor to hand to Lady Henrietta Wentworth, the woman for whom Monmouth, worthy son of his father, had practically abandoned his own wife, the woman with whom he had run off, to the great scandal of court and nation. Despairing of drawing any useful information from Wilding, his lordship was on the point of turning to Blake, when quick steps and the rattle of a scabbard sounded without. The door was thrust open without ceremony, and Captain Wentworth reappeared. Beset, echoed Feversham. Beset already? We can hear them moving on the moor. They are crossing the Langmoor Rhine. They will be upon us in 10 minutes at the most. I have roused Colonel Douglas, and Dunbarton's regiment is ready for them. Feversham exploded. What else have you done? He asked. Where's my Lord Churchill? Lord Churchill is mustering his men as quietly as may be that they may be ready to surprise those who come to surprise us. By heaven, sir, we owe a great debt to Mr. Westmacott. Without his information, we might have had all our throats cut whilst we slept. Be so kind to call Belmont, said Feversham. Tell him to bring my clot, E.S. Wentworth turned and went out again to execute the general's orders. Feversham spoke to Richard. We are obliged, Mr. Westmacott, said he. We are very much obliged. Suddenly from a little distance came the roll of drums. Other sounds began to stir in the night outside to tell of a waking army. Feversham stood listening. It is Dunbarton's, he murmured. Then, with some show of heat, Ah, pardieu, he cried. But it was a dirty tienges, Monmouth. Ave prepare. It is murder. It is not tea war. Feversham pursed his lips and considered the speaker. Wentworth re-entered, followed by the Earl's valet carrying an armful of garments. His lordship threw off his dressing gown and stood forth in shirt and breeches. Captain Wentworth, you will go to your regiment at once. But first, wait, take T06 men and Mistress Wilding. Ave him shot at once, you understand, eh? Good. Allons, Belmont. My cravat. Chapter 22. The Execution. Captain Wentworth clicked his heels together and saluted. Blake, in the background, drew a deep breath, unmistakably of satisfaction, and his eyes glittered. A muffled cry broke from Ruth, who rose instantly from her chair, her hand on her bosom. Richard stood with fallen jaw, amazed, a trifle troubled even, whilst Mr. Wilding started more in surprise and actual fear, and approached the table. You heard, sir, said Captain Wentworth. Feversham, who had taken the cravat, a yard of priceless Dutch lace, from the hands of his valet, and was standing with his back to the company at a small and very faulty mirror that hung by the overmantel, looked peevishly over his shoulder. My lord, said Wilding and Blake, for all his hatred of this man, marveled at a composure that did not forsake him even now. You are surely not proposing to deal with me in this fashion. Not seriously, my lord? Ah, c'est, said the Frenchman. Think it a jest, if you please. What for you come here? Assuredly not for the purpose of being shot, said Wilding, and actually smiled. Then, in the tones of one discussing a matter that is grave but not of surpassing gravity, he continued, It is not that I fail to recognize that I may seem to have incurred the rigor of the law, but these matters must be formally proved against me. I have affairs to set in order against such a consummation. Ta, snapped Feversham. Tat not regard me, Wheatwort. You ave heard my order, and he returned to his mirror and the nice adjustment of his neckwear. But, my lord, insisted Wilding, you have not the right, you have not the power so proceed against me. A man of my quality is not to be shot without a trial. You can on if you prefer, said Feversham indifferently, drawing out the ends of his cravat and smoothing them down upon his breast. He faced about briskly. Give me tiat coat, Belmont. His Majesty, ave empower me to ong or shoot any gentleman's of tea party of tea, duck tea Monmouth, on tea spot. I say tiat for your satisfaction. And look, I am desolate to be so quick with you, but please to consider tea circumstance. Take enemy go to attack. Wentworth must go to his regiment, and my O-tier officers are all occupy. You comprehend, I ave not tea time to spare you in a sepa. Wentworth's hand touched Wilding on the shoulder. He was standing with head slightly bowed, his brows knit in thought. He looked round at the touch, sighed and smiled. Belmont held the coat for his master, who slipped into it, and flung at Wilding what was intended for a consolatory sop. It is fortune de guerre, Mistress Wilding. I am desolate, but it is fortune of tea war. May it be less fortunate for your lordship, then, said Wilding dryly, and was on the point of turning, when Ruth's voice came in a loud cry to startle him and to quicken his pulses. My lord, it was a cry of utter anguish. Feversham, settling his gold-laced coat comfortably to his figure, looked at her. Madam, said he, but she had nothing to say. She stood, deathly white, slightly bent forward, one hand wringing the other, her eyes almost wild, her bosom heaving frantically. Hum, said Feversham, and he loosened and removed the scarf from his head. He shrugged slightly and looked at Wentworth. "Finison," said he. The word and the look snapped the trammels that bound Ruth's speech. 5 minutes, my lord, she cried imploringly. Give him 5 minutes, and me, my lord. Wilding, deeply shaken, trembled now as he awaited Feversham's reply. The Frenchman seemed to waver. Bien, he began, spreading his hands. And in that moment a shot rang out in the night and startled the whole company. Feversham threw back his head. The signs of yielding left his face. "Ha!" he cried. "Te arrive." He snatched his wig from his lackey's hands, donned it, and turned again an instant to the mirror to adjust the great curls. "Quick," went word. "Tears no more time now. Make Mystère Wilding be shot at once. 10 to your regiment." He faced about and took the sword his valet proffered. "Au revoir, messers. Serviteur, madame." And, buckling his sword belt as he went, he swept out, leaving the door wide open, Belmont following, Wentworth saluting and the guards presenting arms. "Come, sir," said the captain in a subdued voice, his eyes avoiding Ruth's face. "I am ready," answered Wilding firmly, and he turned to glance at his wife. She was bending toward him, her hands held out, such a look on her face as almost drove him mad with despair. Reading it as he did, he made a sound deep in his throat before he found words. "Give me 1 minute, sir, 1 minute," he begged Wentworth. "I ask no more than that." Wentworth was a gentleman and not ill-natured, but he was a soldier and had received his orders. He hesitated between the instincts of the two conditions, and what time he did, so there came a clatter of hoofs without to resolve him. It was Feversham departing. "You shall have your minute, sir," said he. "More I dare not give you, as you can see." "From my heart I thank you," answered Mr. Wilding, and from the gratitude of his tone you might have inferred that it was his life Wentworth had accorded him. The captain had already turned aside to address his men. "2 of you outside, guard that window," he ordered. "The rest of you in the passage, bestir there." "Take your precautions by all means, sir," said Wilding. "But I give you my word of honor I shall attempt no escape." Wentworth nodded without replying. His eye lighted on Blake, who had been seemingly forgotten in confusion, and on Richard, a kindliness of the man who met his end so unflinchingly, a respect for so worthy an enemy, actuated the red-faced captain. "You had better take yourself off, Sir Roland," said he. "And you, Mr. Westmacott, you can wait in the passage with my men." They obeyed him promptly enough, but when outside, Sir Roland made bold to remind the captain that he was failing in his duty, and that he should make a point of informing the general of this anon. Wentworth bade him go to the devil, and so was rid of him. Alone inside that low-ceilinged chamber stood Ruth and Wilding face to face. He advanced towards her, and with a shuddering sob she flung herself into his arms. Still, he mistrusted the emotion to which she was a prey, dreading lest it should have its root in pity. He patted her shoulder soothingly. "Nay, nay, little child," he whispered in her ear. "Never weep for me that have not a tear for myself. What better resolution of the difficulties my folly has created?" For only answer she clung closer, her hands locked about his neck, her slender body shaken by her silent weeping. "Don't pity me," he besought her. "I am content it should be so. It is the amend I promised you. Waste no pity on me, Ruth." She raised her face, her eyes wild and blurred with tears, looked up to his. "It is not pity," she cried. "I want you, Anthony. I love you, Anthony, Anthony." His face grew ashen. "It is true, then?" he asked her. "And what you said tonight was true. I thought you said it only to detain me." "No, no, no," she interrupted him passionately, her arms tightening about his neck. He bent his head. Their lips met and clung. A knock fell upon the door. They started, and Wilding raised his hands gently to disengage her pinioning arms. "I must go, sweet," he said. "God help me," she moaned, and clung to him still. "It is I who am killing you, I and your love for me. For it was to save me you rode hither tonight, never pausing away your own deadly danger. Oh, I am punished for having listened to every voice but the voice of my own heart where you were concerned. Had I loved you earlier, had I owned it earlier, it's still been too late," he said, more to comfort her than because he knew it to be so. "Be brave for my sake, Ruth. "You can be brave, I know. So well. Listen, sweet. Your words have made me happy. Mar not this happiness of mine by sending me out in grief at your grief." Her response to his prayer was brave. Indeed. Through her tears came a faint smile to overspread her face, so white and pitiful. "We shall meet soon again," she said. "I think on that," he bade her and pressed her to him. "Goodbye, sweet. God keep you till we meet," he added, his voice infinitely tender. "Mr. Wilding." Wentworth's voice called him, and the captain thrust the door open a foot or so. "Mr. Wilding." At the note of alarm in his voice, Wentworth flung wide the door and entered, Richard's ashen face showing over his shoulder. In her brother's care, Wilding delivered his mercifully unconscious wife. "See to her, Dick," he said, and turned to go, mistrusting himself now. But he paused as he reached the door, Wentworth waxing more and more impatient at his elbow. He turned again. "Dick," he said, "we might have been better friends. I would we had been. Let us part, so at least." And he held out his hand, smiling. "Be good to her, Dick," said Wilding, and went out with Wentworth. He was marched down the street in the center of that small party of musketeers of Dunbarton's regiment, his thoughts all behind him rather than ahead, a smile on his lips. He had conquered at the last. He thought of that other parting of theirs, nearly a month ago, on the road by Walford. Now, as then, circumstance was the fire that had melted her. But the crucible was no longer, as then, of pity. It was the crucible of love. And in that same crucible, too, Anthony Wilding's nature had undergone a transmutation. His love for Ruth had been purified of that base alloy of desire which had driven him into the unworthiness of making her his own at all costs. There was no carnal grossness in his present passion. It was pure as a religion, the love that takes no account of self, the love that makes for joyous and grateful martyrdom. And a joyous and grateful martyr would Anthony Wilding have been could he have thought that his death would bring her happiness or peace. In such a faith as it had marched, or so, he thought blithely to his end, and the smile on his lips had been less wistful than it was. Thinking of the agony in which he had left her, he almost came to wish, so pure was his love grown, that he had not conquered. The joy that at first was his was now all dashed. His death would cause her pain. His death. Oh, God! It is an easy thing to be a martyr, but this was not martyrdom. Having done what he had done, he had not the right to die. The last vestige of the smile that he had worn faded from his tight-pressed lips, tight-pressed as though to endure some physical suffering. His face grayed, and deep lines furrowed his brow. Thus he marched on mechanically, amid his marching escort, through the murky, fog-laden night, taking no heed of the stir about them, for all Western Zoyland was aroused by now. Ahead of them, and over to the east, the firing blazed and crackled, volley upon volley, to tell them that already battle had been joined in earnest. Monmouth's surprise had aborted, and it passed through Wilding's mind that to a great extent he was to blame for this. But it gave him little care. At least his indiscretion had served the purpose of rescuing Ruth from Lord Feversham's unclean clutches. For the rest, knowing that Monmouth's army by far outnumbered Feversham's, he had no doubt that the advantage must still lie with the Duke, in spite of Feversham's having been warned in the 11th hour. Louder grew the sounds of battle. Above the din of firing, a swelling chorus rose upon the night, startling and weird in such a time and place. Monmouth's pious infantry went into action singing hymns, and Wentworth, impatient to be at his post, bade his men go faster. The night was by now growing faintly luminous, and the deathly gray light of approaching dawn hung in the mist upon the moor. Objects grew visible in bulk at least, if not in form and shape, by the time the little company had reached the end of Weston Village and come upon the deep mud dike, which had been Wentworth's objective, a ditch that communicated with the great Rhine that served the king's forces so well on that night of Sedgemoor. Within some 20 paces of this, Wentworth called a halt, and would have had Wilding's hands pinioned behind him and his eyes blindfolded, but that Wilding begged him this might not be done. Wentworth was, as we know, impatient, and between impatience and kindliness, perhaps, he acceded to Wilding's prayer. He even hesitated a moment at the last. It was in his mind to speak some word of comfort to the doomed man. Then a sudden volley, more terrific than any that had preceded it, followed by horse cheering away to eastward, quickened his impatience. He bade the sergeant lead Mr. Wilding forward and stand him on the edge of the ditch. His object was that thus the man's body would be disposed of without waste of time. This Wilding realized, his soul rebelling against his fate, which had come upon him in the very hour where he most desired to live. Mad thoughts of escape crossed his mind, of a leap across the dike and a wild dash through the fog. But the futility of it was too appalling. The musketeers were already blowing their matches. He would suffer the ignominy of being shot in the back, like a coward, if he made any such attempt. And so, despairing but not resigned, he took his stand on the very edge of the ditch. In an irony of obligingness, he set half of his heels over the void, so that he was nicely balanced upon the edge of the cutting, and must go backwards and down into the mud when hit. It was this position he had taken that gave him an inspiration in that last moment. The sergeant had moved away out of the line of fire, and he stood there alone, waiting erect and with his head held high, his eyes upon the gray mass of musketeers, blurred alike by mist and semi-darkness, some 20 paces distant along the line of which glowed 8 red fuses. Wentworth's voice rang out with the words of command. "Blow your matches." Brighter gleamed the points of light, and under their steel pots the faces of the musketeers, suffused by a dull red glow, sprang for a moment out of the gray mass, to fade once more into the general grayness at the word. "Cock your matches." "Guard your pans," came a second later the captain's voice, and then, present, there was a stir and rattle, and the dark, indistinct figure standing on the lip of the ditch was covered by the 8 muskets. To the eyes of the firing party, he was no more than a blurred, shadowy form, showing a little darker than the encompassing dark gray. "Give fire." On the word, Mr. Wilding lost the delicate, precarious balance he had been sustaining on the edge of the ditch, and went over backwards at the imminent risk, as he afterwards related, of breaking his neck. At the same instant, a jagged, 8-pointed line of flame slashed the darkness, and the thunder of the volley pealed forth to lose itself in the greater din of battle on Pennzoil Pound. Hard by. Chapter 23. Mr. Wilding's boots. In the filth of the ditch, Mr. Wilding rolled over and lay prone. He threw out his left arm and rested his brow upon it to keep his face above the mud. He strove to hold his breath, not that he might dissemble death, but that he might avoid being poisoned by the foul gases that, disturbed by his weight, bubbled up to choke him. His body half sank and settled in the mud, and seen from above, as he was presently seen by Wentworth, who ran forward with the sergeant's lantern to assure himself that the work had been well done, he had all the air of being not only dead, but already half buried. And now, for a second, Mr. Wilding was in his greatest danger, and this from the very humaneness of the sergeant. The fellow advanced to the captain's side, a pistol in his hand. Wentworth held the light aloft and peered down into that 6 feet of blackness at the adjacent figure. "Shall I give him an ounce of lead to make sure, Captain?" quoth the sergeant. But Wentworth, in his great haste, had already turned about, and the light of his lantern no longer revealed the form of Mr. Wilding. "There is not the need. The ditch will do what may remain to be done, if anything does. Come on, man. We are wanted yonder." The light passed, steps retreated, the sergeant muttering, and then Wentworth's voice was heard by Wilding some little distance off. "Bring up your muskets. Shoulder. By the right, turn. March." And the tramp of feet receded rapidly. Wilding was already sitting up, endeavoring to get a breath of pure air. He rose to his feet, sinking almost to the top of his boots in the oozy slime. Foul gases were belched up to envelop him. He seized at irregularities in the bank and got his head above the level of the ground. He thrust forward his chin and took great greedy breaths in a very gluttony of air, and never came muscadine sweeter to a drunkard's lips. He laughed softly to himself. He was alone and safe. Wentworth and his men had disappeared. Away in the direction of Pennzoil Pound the sounds of battle swelled ever to a greater volume. Cannons were booming now, and all was uproar, flame and shouting, cheering and shrieking, the thunder of hastening multitudes, the clash of steel, the pounding of horses, all blent to make up the horrid din of carnage. Mr. Wilding listened and considered what to do. His first impulse was to join the fray. But, bethinking him that there could be little place for him in the confusion that must prevail by now, he reconsidered the matter, and his thoughts returning to Ruth, the wife for whom he had been at such pains to preserve himself on the very brink of death. He resolved to endanger himself no further for that night. He dropped back into the ditch and waded, ankle deep in slime, to the other side. There he crawled out, and gaining the moor lay down a while to breathe his lungs. But not for long. The dawn was creeping pale and ghostly across the solid earth, and a faint fresh breeze was stirring and driving the mist in wispy shrouds before it. If he lingered there, he might yet be found by some party of royalist soldiers, and that would be to undo all that he had done. He rose and struck out across the peaty ground. None knew the moors better than did he, and had he been with Gray's horse that night, it is possible things had fared differently, for he had proved a surer guide than did Godfrey, the spy. At first, he thought of making for Bridgewater and Lupton House. By now, Richard would be on his way thither with Ruth, and Wilding was in haste that she should be reassured that he had not fallen to the muskets of Wentworth's firing party. But Bridgewater was far, and he began to realize, now that all excitement was past, that he was utterly exhausted. Next he thought of Scoresby Hall and his cousin Lord Gervis, but he was by no means sure that he might count upon a welcome. Gervis had shown no sympathy for Monmouth or his partisans, and whilst he would hardly go so far as to refuse Mr. Wilding's shelter, still Wilding felt an aversion to seeking what might be grudged him. At last he bethought him of home. Zoyland Chase was near at hand, but he had not been there since his wedding day, and in the meantime he knew that it had been used as a barrack for the militia, and had no doubt that it had been wrecked and plundered. Still, it must have walls and a roof, and that for the time was all he craved, that he might rest a while and recuperate his wasted forces. A half-hour later, he dragged himself wearily up the avenue between the elms, looking white as snow in the pale July dawn, to the clearing in front of his house. Desertion was stamped upon the face of it, shattered windows and hanging shutters everywhere. How wantonly they had wrecked it. It might have been a church, and the militia a regiment of Cromwell's iconoclastic Puritans. The door was locked, but going round he found a window, one of the door windows of his library, hanging loose upon its hinges. He pushed it wide and entered with a heavy heart. Instantly something stirred in the corner. A fierce growl was followed by a furious bark, and a lithe brown body leapt from the greater into the lesser shadows to attack the intruder. But at one word as a hound checked suddenly, crouched an instant, then with a queer, throaty sound bounded forward in a wild delight that robbed it on the instant of its voice. It found it anon and leapt about him, barking furious joy in spite of all his vain endeavors to calm it. He grew afraid, lest the dog should draw attention. He knew not who, if any, might be in possession of his house. The library, as he looked round, showed a scene of wreckage that excellently matched the exterior. Not a picture on the walls, not an arras, but had been rent to shreds. The great luster that had hung from the center of the ceiling was gone. Disorder reigned along the bookshelves, and yet there and elsewhere there was a certain orderliness, suggesting an attempt to straighten up the place after the ravagers had departed. It was these signs made him afraid the house might be tenanted by such as might prove his enemies. "Down, Jack," he said to the dog for the 20th time, patting its sleek head. "Down, down." But still the dog bounded about him, barking wildly. S.A.T.S. suddenly. Steps sounded in the hall. It was as he feared. The door was suddenly thrown open, and the gray morning light gleamed upon the long barrel of a musket. After it, bearing it, entered a white-haired old man. He paused on the threshold, measuring the tall, disordered stranger who stood there, his figure a black silhouette against the window by which he had entered. "What seek you here, sir, in this house of desolation?" asked the voice of Mr. Wilding's old servant. He answered but one word: "Walters." The musket dropped with a clatter from the old man's hands. He sank back against the doorpost and leaned there an instant. Then, whimpering and laughing, he came tottering forward, his old legs failing him in this excess of unexpected joy, and sank on his knees to kiss his master's hand. Wilding patted the old head, as he had patted the dog's a little while ago. He was oddly moved. There was a knot in his throat. No homecoming could well have been more desolate. And yet, what homecoming could have brought him such a torturing joy as was now his? Oh, it is good to be loved. It would be by no more than a dog and an old servant. In a moment, Walters was himself again. He was on his feet, scrutinizing Wilding's haggard face and disordered, filthy clothes. He broke into exclamations between dismay and reproach. But these Wilding interrupted to ask the old man how it happened that he had remained. "My son John was a sergeant in the troop that quartered itself here, sir," Walters explained. "And so they left me alone. But even had it not been for that, I scarcely think they would have harmed an old man. They were brave fellows for all the mischief they did here, and they seemed to have little heart in the service of the popish king. It was the officers drove them on to all this damage, and once they'd started, well, there were rogues amongst them saw a chance of plunder, and they took it. I have sought to put the place to rights, but they did some woeful, wanton mischief." Wilding sighed. "It's little matter, perhaps, as the place is no longer mine." "No longer yours, sir. I'm an attainted outlaw, Walters," he explained. "They'll bestow it on some popish time server, unless King Monmouth can follow up by greater victories tonights. Have you aught a man may eat or drink? Meat and wine, fresh linen and fresh garments did old Walters find him. And when he had washed, eaten, and drunk, Mr. Wilding wrapped himself in a dressing gown and laid himself down to sleep on a settle in the library, his servant and his dog on guard. Not above an hour, however, was he destined to enjoy his hard-earned rest. The light had grown, meanwhile, and from gray it had turned golden, the heralds of the sun being already in the east. In the distance the firing had died down to a mere occasional boom. Suddenly old Walters raised his head to listen. The beat of hoofs was drawing rapidly near, so near that presently he rose in alarm, for a horseman was pounding up the avenue, had drawn rein at the main entrance. Walters knit his brows in perplexity, and glanced at his master, who slept on utterly worn out. A silent pause followed, lasting some minutes. Then it was the dog that rose with growl, his coat bristling, and an instant later there came a sharp rapping at the hall door. "S.H. Down, Jack," whispered Walters, afraid of rousing Mr. Wilding. He tiptoed softly across the room, picked up his musket, and, calling the dog, went out, a great fear in his heart, but not for himself. The rapping continued, growing every instant more urgent, so urgent that Walters was almost reassured. Here was no enemy, but surely someone in need. Walters opened at last, and Mr. Trenchard, grimy of face and hands, his hat shorn of its plumes, his clothes torn, staggered with an oath across the threshold. "Walters," he cried, "thank God, I thought you'd be here, but I wasn't certain. Down, Jack." The hound was barking madly again, having recognized an old friend. "Plague on the dog," growled Walters. "He'll wake Mr. Wilding." "Mr. Wilding?" said Trenchard, and checked midway across the hall. "Mr. Wilding? He arrived here a couple of hours ago, sir." "Wilding here? Odds heart, I was more than well advised come. Where is he, man?" "S.H., sir. He's asleep in the library." You'll wake him." But Trenchard never paused. He crossed the hall at a bound and flung wide the library door. "Anthony!" he shouted. "Anthony!" And in the background Walters cursed him for a fool. Wilding leapt to his feet, awake and startled. "Wah, Nick!" "Owens!" roared Nick. "You're choicely found. I came to send to Bridgewater for you. We must away at once, man." "How away? I thought you were in the fight, Nick." "And don't I look as if I had been? But then, the fight is fought and lost. There's an end to the garboil. Monmouth is in full flight, with what's left him of his horse. When I quitted the field, he was riding hard for Polden Hill." He dropped into a chair, his accents grim and despairing, his eyes haggard. "Loss?" gasped Wilding, and his conscience pricked him for a moment, remembering how much it had been his fault, however indirectly, that Feversham had been forewarned. "But how lost?" he cried a moment later. "Ask Gray," snapped Trenchard. "Ask his craven, numbskulled lordship. He had as good a hand in losing it as any." "Oh!" It was almost infernally mishandled, as had been everything in this ill-starred rising. Gray sent back Godfrey, the guide, and attempted in the dark to find his own way across the Rhine. He missed the ford. What else could the fool have hoped? And when he was discovered and Dunbarton's guns began to play on us, hell and fire, we ran as if Sedgemoor had been a race course. The rest was but the natural sequel. The foot, seeing our confusion, broke. They were rallied again, broke again, and again were rallied, but all too late. The enemy was up, and with that damn ditch between us, there was no getting to close quarters with them. Had Gray ridden round and sought to turn their flank, things might have been, oh God! They would have been entirely different. I did suggest it, but for my pains, Gray threatened to pistol me if I presumed to instruct him in his duty. I would to heaven I had pistoled him where he stood. Walters, at gaze in the doorway, listened to the bitter tirade. Wilding, on the settle, sat silent a moment, his elbows on his knees, his chin in his hands, his eyes set and grim as Trenchard's own. Then he mastered himself and waved a hand towards a table where stood food and wine. "Eat and drink, Nick," he said, "and we'll discuss what's to be done." "It'll need little discussing," was Nick's savage answer as he rose and went to pour himself a cup of wine. "There's but one course open to us, instant flight. I am for Minehead to join Hewling's horse, which went there yesterday for guns. We might seize a ship somewhere on the coast, and thus get out of this infernal country of mine." They discussed the matter in spite of Trenchard's having said that there was nothing to discuss, and in the end Wilding agreed to go with him. What choice had he? But first he must go to Bridgewater to reassure his wife. "To Bridgewater?" blazed Trenchard, in a passion at the folly of the suggestion. "You're clearly mad. All the king's forces will be there in an hour or two." "No matter," said Wilding. "I must go. I am dead already, as it happens." And he related his singular adventure in Feversham's camp last night. Trenchard heard him in amazement. If any suspicion crossed his mind that his friend's love affairs had anything to do with rousing Feversham prematurely, he showed no sign of it. But he shook his head at Wilding's insistence that he must first go to Lupton House. "Shout sent a message, Anthony. Walters will find someone to bear it. But you must not go yourself." In the end, Mr. Trenchard prevailed upon him to adopt this course, however reluctant he might be. Thereafter they proceeded to make their preparations. There were still a couple of nags in the stables, in spite of the visitation of the militia, and Walters was able to find fresh clothes for Mr. Trenchard above stairs. A half-hour later, they were ready to set out on this forlorn hope of escape. The horses were at the door, and Mr. Wilding was in the act of drawing on the fresh pair of boots which Walters had fetched him. Suddenly he paused, his foot in the leg of his right boot, and sat bemused a moment. Trenchard, watching him, waxed impatient. "What ails you now?" he croaked. Without answering him, Wilding turned to Walters. "Where are the boots I wore last night?" he asked, and his voice was sharp, oddly sharp, considering how trivial the matter of his speech. "In the kitchen," answered Walters. "Fetch me them." And he kicked off again the boot he had half drawn on. "But they're all befouled with mud, sir." "Clean them, Walters. Clean them and let me have them." Still Walters hesitated, pointing out that the boots he had brought his master were newer and sounder. Wilding interrupted him impatiently. "Do as I bid you, Walters." And the old man, understanding nothing, went off on the errand. "A pox on your boots," swore Trenchard. "What does this mean?" Wilding seemed suddenly to have undergone a transformation. His gloom had fallen from him. He looked up at his old friend and, smiling, answered him. "It means, Nick, that whilst these excellent boots that Walters would have me wear might be well enough for a ride to the coast, such as you propose, they are not at all suited to the journey I intend to make." "Maybe," said Nick with a sniff, "your intended journey to Tower Hill?" "In that direction," answered Mr. Wilding suavely. "I am for London, Nick, and you shall come with me. God save us. Do you keep a fool's egg under that nest of hair?" Wilding explained, and by the time Walters returned with the boots, Trenchard was walking up and down the room in an odd agitation. "Odds my life, Tony," he cried at last. "I believe it is the best thing. The only thing, Nick. And since all is lost, why—" Trenchard blew out his cheeks and smacked fist into palm. "I am with you," said he. Chapter 24. Justice. It has fallen to my lot in the course of this veridical chronicle of Mr. Anthony Wilding's connection with the rebellion in the West, and of his wedding and postnuptial winning of Ruth Westmacott, to relate certain matters of incident and personality that may be accounted strange. But the strangest yet remains to be related. For in spite of all that had passed between Sir Rowland Blake and the Westmacotts on that memorable night of Sunday to Monday, on which the Battle of Sedgemoor was lost and won, toward the end of that same month of July, we find him not only back at Lupton House, but once again the avowed suitor of Mr. Wilding's widow. For effrontery, this is a matter which it is to be doubted whether history furnishes a parallel. Indeed, until the circumstances are sifted it seems wild and incredible. So let us consider these. On the morrow of Sedgemoor, the town of Bridgewater became invested. Infested were no whit too strong a word, by the king's forces under Feversham and the odious Kirk, and there began a reign of terror for the town. The prisons were choked with the tainted and suspected rebels. From Bridgewater to Weston Zoyland the road was become an avenue of gallows, each bearing its repulsive, grimace-laden burden. For the king's commands were unequivocal, and hanging was the order of the day. It is not my desire at this stage to surfeit you with the horrors that were perpetrated during that hideous week of July, when no man's life was safe from the royal butchers. The awful campaign of Jeffreys and his 4 associates was yet to follow, but it is doubtful if it could compare in ruthlessness with that of Feversham and Kirk. At least, when Jeffreys came, men were given a trial, or what looked like it, and there remained them a chance, however slender, of acquittal, as many lived to prove thereafter. With Feversham there was no such chance, and it was of this circumstance that Sir Rowland Blake took the fullest and the cowardliest advantage. There can be no doubt that Sir Rowland was a villain. It might be urged for him that he was a creature of circumstance, and that had circumstances been other, it is possible he had been a credit to his name. But he was weak in character, and out of that weakness he had developed a Herculean strength and villainy. Failure had dogged him in everything he undertook. Broken at the gaming tables, hounded out of town by creditors, he was in desperate straits to repair his fortunes, and, as we have seen, he was not nice in his endeavors to achieve that end. Ruth Westmacott's fair inheritance had seemed an easy thing to conquer, and to its conquest he had applied himself to suffer defeat as he had suffered it in all things else. But Sir Rowland did not yet acknowledge himself beaten, and the Bridgewater reign of terror dealt him a fresh hand, a hand of trumps. With this, he came boldly to renew the game. He was as smooth as oil at first, a very penitent, confessing himself mad in what he had done on that Sunday night. Mad with despair and rage at having been defeated in the noble task to which he had turned his hands. His penitence might have had little effect upon the Westmacotts had he not known how to insinuate that it might be best for them to lend an ear to it, and a forgiving one. "You will tell Mr. Westmacott, Jasper," he had said, when Jasper told him that they could not receive him, "that he would be unwise not to see me, and the same to Mistress Wilding." And old Jasper had carried his message, and had told Richard of the wicked smile that had been on Sir Rowland's lips when he had uttered it. Now Richard was in many ways a changed man since that night at Weston Zoyland. A transformation seemed to have been wrought in him as odd as it was sudden, and it dated from a moment when with tears in his eyes he had wrung Wilding's hand in farewell. Where precept had failed, Richard found himself converted by example. He contrasted himself in that stressful hour with great-souled Anthony Wilding, and saw himself as he was, a weakling, strong only in vicious ways. Repentance claimed him. Repentance and a fine ambition to be worthier, to resemble as nearly as his nature would allow him this Anthony Wilding whom he took for pattern. He changed his ways, abandoned drink and gaming, and gained thereby a healthier countenance. Then in his zeal, he overshot his mark. He developed a taste for scripture reading, bethought him of prayers, and even took to saying grace to his meat. Indeed, for conversion, when it comes, is a furious thing. The swing of his soul's pendulum threatened now to carry him to extremes of virtue and piety. "O Lord," he would cry a score times a day, "Thou hast brought up my soul from the grave. Thou hast kept me alive that I should not go down to the pit." But underlying all this remained unfortunately the inherent weakness of his nature. Indeed, it was that very weakness and malleability made this sudden and wholesale conversion possible. Upon hearing Sir Rowland's message his heart fainted, despite his good intentions, and he urged that perhaps they had better hear what the baronet might have to say. It was 3 days after Sedgemoor fight, and poor Ruth was worn and exhausted with her grief, believing Wilding dead, for he had sent no message to inform her of his almost miraculous preservation. The thing he went to do in London was fraught with such peril that he foresaw but the slenderest chance of escaping with his life. Therefore he had argued, why console her now with news that he lived, when in a few days a headsman might prove that his end had been but postponed. To do so might be to give her cause to mourn him twice. Again he was haunted by the thought that, in spite of all, It may have been pity that had so grievously moved her at their last meeting. Better, then, to wait, better for both their sakes. If he came safely through his ordeal, it would be time enough to bear her news of his preservation. In deepest mourning, very white, with dark stains beneath her eyes to tell the tale of anguished vigils, she received Sir Roland in the withdrawing room, her brother at her side. To his expressions of deep penitence, he found them cold. So he passed on to show them what disastrous results might ensue upon a stubborn maintaining of this attitude of theirs towards him. "I have come," he said, his eyes downcast, his face long drawn, for he could play the sorrowful with any hypocrite in England, "to do something more than speak of my grief and regret. I have come to offer proof of it by service." "We ask no service of you, sir," said Ruth, her voice a sword of sharpness. He sighed and turned to Richard. "This were folly," he assured his whilom friend. "You know the influence I wield." "Do I?" quoth Richard, his tone implying doubt. "You think that the bungled matter at Nullington's may have shaken it?" Quoth Blake, "With Feversham, perhaps, but Albemarle, remember, trust me very fully. There are ugly happenings in the town here. Men are being hung like linen on a washing day. Be not too sure that yourself are free from all danger." Richard paled under Baronet's baleful, half-sneering glance. "Be not in too great haste to cast me aside, for you may find me useful." "Do you threaten, sir?" cried Ruth. "Threaten?" quoth he. He turned up his eyes and showed the whites of them. "Is it to threaten to promise you my protection? To show you how I can serve you, than which I ask no sweeter boon of heaven, a word from me, and Richard need fear nothing." "He need fear nothing without that word," said Ruth disdainfully. "Such service as he did Lord Feversham the other night is soon forgotten," Blake cut in adroitly. "Indeed, 'twill be most convenient to his lordship to forget it. Think you he would care to have it known that 'twas to such a chance he owes the preservation of his army?" He laughed, and added in a voice of much sly meaning, "The times are full of peril. There's Kirk and his lambs, and there's no saying how Kirk might act did he chance to learn what Richard failed to do that night, when he was left to guard the rear at Nullington's." "Would you inform him of it?" cried Richard, between anger and alarm. Blake thrust out his hands in a gesture of horrified repudiation. "Richard," he cried in deep reproof, and again, "Richard!" "What other tongue has your fear?" asked Ruth. "Am I the only one who knows of it?" cried Blake. "Oh, madam, why will you ever do me such injustice? Richard has been my friend, my dearest friend. I wish him so to continue, and I swear that he shall find me his, as you shall find me yours." "It is a boon I could dispense with," she assured him, and rose. "This talk can profit little. Sir Roland," said she, "you seek to bargain." "You shall see how unjust you are," he cried with deep sorrow. "It is but fitting, perhaps, after what has passed. It is my punishment. But you shall come to acknowledge that you have done me wrong. You shall see how I shall befriend and protect him." That said, he took his leave and went, but he left behind him a shrewd seed of fear in Richard's mind, and of the growth that sprang from it Richard almost unconsciously transplanted something in the days that followed into the heart of Ruth. As a result, to make sure that no harm should come to her brother, the last of his name and race, she resolved to receive Sir Roland, resolved in spite of Diana's outspoken scorn, in spite of Richard's protests. For though afraid, yet he would not have it so, in spite even of her own deep repugnance to the man. Days passed and grew to weeks. Bridgewater was settling down to peace again, to peace and mourning. The royalist scourge had spread to Taunton, and Blake lingered on at Lupton House, an unwelcome but an undeniable guest. His presence was as detestable to Richard now as it was to Ruth, for Richard had to submit to the mockery with which the town rake lashed his godly bearing in altered ways. More than once in gusts of sudden valor, the boy urged his sister to permit him to drive the baronet from the house and let him do his worst. But Ruth, afraid for Richard, bade him wait until the times were more settled. When the royal vengeance had slaked its lust for blood, it might matter little, perhaps, what tale Sir Roland might elect to carry. And so Sir Roland remained and waited. He assured himself that he knew how to be patient, and congratulated himself upon that circumstance. Wilding dead, a little time must now suffice to blunt the sharp edge of his widow's grief. Let him but await that time, and the rest should be easy, the battle his. With Richard, he did not so much as trouble himself to reckon. Thus he determined, and thus no doubt he would have acted but for an unforeseen contingency. A miserable, paltry creditor had smoked him out in his Somerset retreat, and got a letter to him full of dark hints of a debtor's jail. The fellow's name was Swiney, and Sir Rowland knew him for fierce and pertinacious where a defaulting creditor was concerned. One only course remained him, to force matters with Wilding's widow. For days he refrained, fearing that precipitancy might lose him all. It was his wish to do the thing without too much coercion. He was not coxcomb enough to think, coxcomb though he was, might be dispensed with. At last one Sunday evening, he decided to be done with dallying and to bring Ruth between the hammer and the anvil of his will. It was the last Sunday in July, exactly 3 weeks after Sedgemoor, and the odd coincidence of his having chosen such a day and hour you shall appreciate anon. They were on the lawn taking the cool of the evening after an oppressively hot day. By the stone seat, now occupied by Lady Horton and Diana, Richard lay on the sward at their feet in talk with them. And their talk was of Sir Rowland. Diana, gall in her soul to see the baronet by way of gaining yet his ends, chid Richard in strong terms for his weakness in submitting to Blake's constant presence at Lupton House. And Richard meekly took her chiding and promised that, if Ruth would but sanction it, things should be changed upon the morrow. Sir Rowland, all unconscious, reckless, indeed, of this, sauntered with Ruth some little distance from them, having contrived adroitly to draw her aside. He broke a spell of silence with a dolorous sigh. "Ruth," said he pensively, "I mind me of the last evening on which you and I walked here alone." She flashed him a glance of fear and aversion, and stood still. Under his brow he watched the quick heave of her bosom, the sudden flow and abiding ebb of blood in her face, grown now so thin and wistful, and he realized that before him lay no easy task. He set his teeth for battle. "Will you never have a kindness for me, Ruth?" he sighed. She turned about, her intent to join the others, a dull anger in her soul. He sat a hand upon her arm. "Wait," said he, and the tone in which he uttered that one word kept her beside him. His manner changed a little. "I am tired of this," said he. "Why, so am I," she answered bitterly. "Since we are agreed so far, let us agree to end it. It is all I ask." "Yes, but, alas," in a different way. "Listen now." "I will not listen. Let me go. I were your enemy did I do so, for you would know hereafter a sorrow and repentance for which nothing short of death could offer you escape. Richard is under suspicion. Do you hark back to that?" The scorn of her voice was deadly. Had it been herself he desired, surely that tone had quenched all passion in him, or else transformed it into hatred. But Blake was playing for a fortune, for shelter from a debtor's prison. "It has become known," he continued, "that Richard was one of the early plotters who paved the way for Monmouth's coming. I think that, in conjunction with his betrayal of his trust that night at Nullington's, thereby causing the death of some 20 gallant fellows of King James's, will be enough to hang him." Her hand clutched at her heart. "What is you seek?" she cried. It was almost a moan. "What is you want of me?" "Yourself," said he. "I love you, Ruth," he added, and stepped close up to her. "Oh, God!" she cried aloud. "Had I a man at hand to kill you for that insult?" And then, miracle of miracles, a voice in the shrubs by which they stood bored her ears the startling words that told her prayer was answered there and then. "Madam, that man is here." She stood frozen. Not more of a statue was Lot's wife in the moment of looking behind her than she who dared not look behind. That voice, a voice from the dead, a voice she had heard for the last time in the cottage that was Feversham's lodging at Weston Zoyland. Her wild eyes fell upon Sir Rowland's face. It showed livid, the nether lip sucked in and caught in strong teeth, as if to prevent an outcry, the eyes wild with fright. What did it mean? By an effort, she wrenched herself round at last, and a scream broke from her to rouse her aunt, her cousin, and her brother, and bring them hastening towards her across the sweep of lawn. Before her, on the edge of the shrubbery, a gray figure stood erect and graceful in the face, with its thin lips faintly smiling, its dark eyes gleaming, was the face of Anthony Wilding. And as she stared, he moved forward, and she heard the fall of his foot upon the turf, the clink of his spurs, the swish of his scabbard against the shrubs, and reason told her that this was no ghost. She held out her arms to him. "Anthony! Anthony!" She staggered forward, and he was no more than in time to catch her as she swayed. He held her fast against him and kissed her brow. "Sweet," he said, "forgive me that I frightened you. I came by the orchard gate, and my coming was so timely that I could not hold in my answer to your cry." Her eyelids fluttered. She drew a long, sighing breath and nestled closer to him. "Anthony," she murmured again, and reached up a hand to stroke his face, to feel that it was truly living flesh. And Sir Rowland, realizing, too, by now that he was no ghost, recovered his lost courage. He put a hand to his sword, then withdrew it, leaving the weapon sheathed. Here was a hangman's job, not a swordsman's, he opined, and wisely, for he had had earlier experience of Mr. Wilding's play of steel. He advanced a step. "Oh, fool," he snarled. "The hangman waits for you. And a creditor for you, Sir Rowland," came the voice of Mr. Trenchard, who now pushed forward through those same shrubs that had masked his friend's approach. "A Mr. Swiney. 'Twas I sent him from town. He's lodged at the Bull, and bellows like one when he speaks of what you owe him. There are 3 messengers with him, and they tell of a debtor's jail for you, sweetheart." A spasm of fury crossed the face of Blake. "They may have me in welcome when I've told my tale," said he. "Let me but tell of Anthony Wilding's lurking here, and not only Anthony Wilding, but all the rest of you are doomed for harboring him. You know the law, I think. He mocked them." For Lady Horton, Diana, and Richard, who had come up, stood now a pace or so away in deepest wonder. "You shall know it better before the night is out, and better still before next Sunday's come." "Tush," said Trenchard, and quoted, "There's none but Anthony may conquer Anthony." "'Tis clear," said Wilding. "You take me for a rebel, an odd mistake. For it chances, Sir Rowland, that you behold in me an accredited servant of the Secretary of State." Blake stared, then fell a prey to ironic laughter. He would have spoken, but Mr. Wilding plucked a paper from his pocket and handed it to Trenchard. "Show it him," said he, and Blake's face grew white again as he read the lines above Sunderland's signature and observed the seals of office. He looked from the paper to the hated, smiling face of Mr. Wilding. "You were a spy," he said, his tone making a question of the odious statement. "A dirty spy? Your incredulity is flattering, at least," said Wilding pleasantly as he repocketed the parchment, "and it leads you in the right direction. I neither was nor am a spy." "That paper proves it," cried Blake contemptuously. Having been a spy himself, he was a good judge of the vileness of the office. "See to my wife, Nick," said Wilding sharply, and made as if to transfer her to the care of his friend. "Nay," said Trenchard, "'tis your own duty that. Let me discharge the other for you." And he stepped up to Blake and tapped him briskly on the shoulder. "Sir Rowland," said he, "you're a knave." Sir Rowland stared at him. "You're a foul thing, a muckworm, Sir Rowland," added Trenchard amiably, "and you've been discourteous to a lady, for which may heaven forgive you, I can't." "Stand aside," Blake bade him, hoarse with passion, blind to all risks. "My affair is with Mr. Wilding." "Aye," said Trenchard, "but mine is with you. If you survive it, you can settle what other affairs you please, including, belike, your business with Mr. Swiney." "Not so, Nick," said Wilding suddenly, and turned to Richard. "Here, Richard, take her," he bade his brother-in-law. "Anthony, you damned shirk duty. See to your wife. Leave me to my own diversions. Sir Rowland," he reminded the baronet, "I have called you a knave and a foul thing in faith. If you want it proven, you need but step down the orchard with me." He saw hesitation lingering in Sir Rowland's face, and he uncurled the last of the whip he carried. "I grieve to do a violent thing before the ladies," he murmured deprecatingly. "I'd never respect myself again if I had to drive a gentleman of your quality to the ground of honor with a horsewhip. But, as God's my life, if you don't go willingly this instant, 'tis what will happen." Richard's newborn righteousness prompted him to interfere, to seek to avert this threatened bloodshed. His humanity urged him to let matters be, and his humanity prevailed. Diana watched this foreshadowing of tragedy with tight lips, pale cheeks. Justice was to be done at last, it seemed, and as her frightened eye fell upon Sir Rowland, she knew not whether to exult or weep. Her mother, understanding nothing, plied her meanwhile with whispered questions. As for Sir Rowland, he looked into the old rake's eyes agleam with wicked mirth, and rage welled up to choke him. He must kill this man. Come, said he. I'll see to your fine friend Wilding afterwards. Excellent, said Trenchard, and led the way through the shrubbery to the orchard. Ruth, reviving, looked up. Her glance met Mr. Wilding's. It quickened into understanding, and she stirred. Is it true? Is it really true? She cried. I am being tortured by this dream again. Nay, sweet, it is true, it is true. I am here. Say, shall I stay? She clung to him for answer. And you are in no danger? In none, sweet. I am Mr. Wilding of Zoyland Chase, free to come and go as best shall seem to me. He begged the others to leave him a little while, and he led her to the stone seat by the river. He set her at his side there and told her the story of his escape from the firing party, and of the inspiration that had come to him on the morrow to make use of the letter in his boot which Sunderland had given him for Monmouth in the hour of panic. Monmouth's cavalier treatment of him when he had arrived in Bridgewater had precluded his delivering that letter at the council. There was never another opportunity. Nor did he again think of the package in the stressful hours that followed. It was not until the following morning that he suddenly remembered it lay undelivered, and bethought him that it might prove a weapon to win him delivery from the dangers that encompassed him. It was a slender chance, he told her, but I employed it. I waited in London, in hiding. Close upon a fortnight ere I had an opportunity of seeing Sunderland. He laughed me to scorn at first, and threatened me with the Tower. But I told him the letter was in safe hands, and would remain there in earnest of his good behavior, and that did he have me arrested, it would instantly be laid before the king, and bring his own head to the block more surely even than my own. It frightened him, but it had scarcely done so, sweet, had he known that that precious letter was still in my boot, for my boot was on my leg, and my leg was in a room with the rest of me. He surrendered at last, and gave me papers proving that Trenchard and I, for I stipulated for old Nick's safety too, were His Majesty's accredited agents in the West. I loathed the title, but he spread his hands and smiled. It was that or widowing you. She took his face in her hands and stroked it fondly, and they sat thus until a dry cough behind them roused them from their joyous silence. Mr. Trenchard was sauntering toward them, his left eye tucked farther under his hat than usual, his hands behind him. "'Tis a thirsty evening," he informed them. "Go, tell Richard so," said Wilding, who knew naught of Richard's altered ways. "I've thought of it, but haply he's sensitive on the score of drinking with me again. He has done it twice to his undoing. He'll do a third time, no doubt," said Mr. Wilding curtly, and Trenchard, taking the hint, turned with a shrug and went up the lawn toward the house. He found Richard in the porch, where he had lingered fearfully, waiting for news. At sight of Mr. Trenchard's grim, weather-beaten countenance, he came forward suddenly. "How has it sped?" he asked, his lips twitching on the words. "Yonder they sit," said Trenchard, pointing down the lawn. No, I mean Sir Rowland." "Oh, Sir Rowland?" cried the old sinner, as though Sir Rowland were some matter long forgotten. He sighed. "Alas, poor swiney, I fear I've cheated him." "You mean?" "Art slow at inference, Dick. Sir Rowland has passed away in the odor of villainy." Richard clasped nervous hands together and raised his colorless eyes to heaven. "May the Lord have mercy on his soul," said he. "May he indeed," said Trenchard, when he recovered from his surprise. "But," he added pessimistically, "I doubt the rogues in hell." Richard's eyes kindled suddenly, and he quoted from the 30th Psalm, "I will extol thee, O Lord, for thou hast lifted me up, and hast not made my foes to rejoice over me." Dumbfounded, wondering, indeed, was Westmacott's mind unhinged. Trenchard scanned him narrowly. Richard caught the glance and misinterpreted it for one of reproof. He bethought him that his joy was unrighteous. He stifled it, and forced his lips to sigh. "Poor Blake!" "Poor indeed," quoth Trenchard, and adapted a remembered line of his play-acting days to suit the case. "The tears live in an onion that shall water his grave. Though, perhaps, I am forgetting swiney." Then, in a brisker tone, "Come, Richard, what like is the muscadine you keep at Lupton House?" "I have abjured all wine," said Richard. "A plague you have," quoth Trenchard, understanding less and less. "Have you turned Mussulman, perchance?" "No," answered Richard sternly. "Christian." Trenchard hesitated, rubbing his nose thoughtfully. "Hum," said he at length. Peace be with you. Then, I'll leave you here to bathe the moon to your heart's content. Perhaps Jasper will know where to find me a brainwash. And with final suspicious, wondering look at the whilom bibber, he passed into the house, much exercised on the score of the sanity of this family into which his friend Anthony had married. Outside, the twilight shadows were deepening. "Shall we home, sweet?" whispered Mr. Wilding. The shadows befriended her, a veil for her sudden confusion. She breathed something that seemed